Welcome back. Tonight, we settle in with the gentle hum of electromagnetic induction as we follow Michael Faraday, a bookbinder's apprentice with no formal education, through the quiet, lamplit basement of the Royal Institution, where he spent long hours winding copper wire around iron rings, carefully noting each flicker of his galvanometer's needle, never rushing, never doubting that patience itself was a kind of genius, and where the invisible lines of force he imagined would one day power the very world drifting past your window now. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if these stories help you drift off peacefully. Now, dim the lights. Pull the blanket a little closer. And together, let us ease gently into tonight's story. Michael Faraday came into the world on the 22nd of September, in the year 1791, in a place called Newington Butts, which was then a village just south of the River Thames, in the county of Surrey, not yet swallowed up by the great spreading mass of London, though close enough that one could walk into the city proper within the hour. The name Newington Butts had nothing to do with butchers or their trade, as one might imagine, but rather referred to the archery butts, the earthen mounds behind targets, where in centuries past the local men had practiced their bowmanship, as required by old laws that had long since faded from memory and from practice. By the time Michael was born there, the area had become a modest neighborhood of tradespeople and laborers, of small houses and workshops, of families who worked with their hands and lived by the strength of their backs and the steadiness of their craftsmanship. His father was James Faraday, a blacksmith by trade, who had come down to the London area from a very different sort of place altogether. James had grown up in Arthgill, a small village in Westmoreland, in the north of England, where the hills roll green and grey beneath wide skies, and where the pace of life moved according to the seasons and the needs of the farming communities scattered across that quiet landscape. Westmoreland is a county of stone walls and sheep, of becks and fells, and Arthgill itself sits in the Malastang Valley, beneath the long ridge of Wild Boar Fell, in country that feels very far removed from the smoke and noise and ceaseless activity of London. Why James Faraday left this peaceful northern home to seek his fortune in the south, we cannot say with certainty, though it was common enough in those days for young tradesmen to travel in search of work, following rumors of opportunity, hoping to establish themselves in places where there might be more demand for their skills. A blacksmith's work was essential in that era, for horses needed shoeing, and carts needed their iron fittings, and tools of all kinds required forging and mending, and gates and hinges and nails and countless other items of daily necessity came from the blacksmith's forge. It was honest and respected work, though physically demanding, requiring strength and stamina and the ability to stand for long hours before the heat of the fire, working the bellows, heating the iron until it glowed, and shaping it with hammer and anvil into whatever form was needed. James Faraday had learned this trade in the north, and he brought his skill southward, and in due course he married a woman named Margaret Hastwell, and together they began their family in the modest circumstances that their situation afforded. Margaret Hastwell, who became Margaret Faraday, was herself from the north of England, and she brought to the marriage a steadiness and a practical wisdom that would serve the family well through the difficulties that lay ahead. She was, by all accounts, a woman of strong faith and gentle disposition, devoted to her children and capable of managing a household even when resources were painfully scarce. The marriage of James and Margaret was, like so many marriages of working people in that era, a partnership of shared labor and shared struggle, of making do with little and finding contentment where it could be found. The Faraday family belonged to a small Christian sect known as the Sandemanians, sometimes called the Glassites after their founder, John Glass, a Scottish minister who had broken away from the Church of Scotland in the early 18th century. The movement was later shaped and led by Robert Sandeman, Glass' son-in-law, from whom the name Sandemanian derived. This was a quiet and close-knit religious community, quite separate from the established Church of England, and its members held beliefs and practices that set them somewhat apart from the broader society around them. The Sandemanians believed in a simple and literal reading of the New Testament, and they sought to model their community life on the practices of the early Christian church as described in the book of Acts. They shared meals together. They washed one another's feet in imitation of Christ's example. They drew lots to make certain decisions, and they kept themselves somewhat apart from the political and social ambitions of the wider world. For the Faraday family, this faith was not merely a Sunday observance but a way of living, a framework that shaped their values and their relationships and their understanding of their place in the world. The Sandemanians emphasized humility and honesty and the careful stewardship of whatever gifts one had been given. They were suspicious of worldly success pursued for its own sake, and they believed that one's work, whatever it might be, should be carried out with diligence and integrity, as a form of service. Michael Faraday would remain a faithful Sandemanian throughout his entire life, serving as an elder in the London Meeting House, and the values instilled in him during his childhood, the habits of humility and careful truthfulness and quiet devotion, would remain with him always, shaping not only his personal character but also, in subtle ways, his approach to scientific inquiry, his insistence on following the evidence wherever it led, his reluctance to claim more than the facts supported, his sense that the natural world was worthy of reverent attention. But in those early years, in the 1790s, such matters lay far in the future, and the immediate reality was one of considerable hardship. James Faraday was not a well man. He suffered from chronic ill health that limited his ability to work at the forge, and for a blacksmith, whose livelihood depended entirely upon physical labor, this was a serious difficulty indeed. There were times when he could not work at all, and there were times when he could manage only light tasks, and the family's income suffered accordingly. England in the 1790s was not an easy place for poor families. The country was at war, or nearly at war, with revolutionary France, and the disruptions of that conflict rippled through the economy in ways that made life harder for working people. Food prices rose, work became uncertain, and for families already on the margins, the struggle to get by became ever more difficult. During periods of particular scarcity, the Faraday family received, as relief, 1 loaf of bread per week, to be divided among them all. 1 loaf, for a family with several children, is not very much bread at all, and one can imagine the care with which it must have been portioned out, each slice measured and allocated, each crumb valued. This was the poverty of Michael Faraday's childhood, not the dramatic destitution of complete homelessness, but the grinding, persistent poverty of never quite having enough, of wearing clothes until they could be mended no more, of knowing that there was no margin for error, no reserve to fall back upon should things grow worse. Michael was not the eldest child. His older brother Robert had come first, and Robert would grow up to become a blacksmith himself, following in their father's trade. There were also 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Margaret, and together the children formed a small household within rooms that the family rented, cramped quarters where privacy was scarce and where everyone lived in close proximity to everyone else. Around the year 1796, when Michael was perhaps 4 or 5 years old, the family moved to new lodgings, rooms situated over a coach house in a place called Jacob's Well Mews, near Manchester Square, in the West End of London. A mews, in the language of London, was a row of stables and coach houses, often with living quarters above, located behind the grand houses of the wealthy, and Jacob's Well Mews was one such place, tucked away behind the more fashionable streets, home to the coachmen and grooms and other working people who served the households of their betters. This was the London of Michael Faraday's childhood, a city of stark contrasts, where great wealth and grinding poverty existed side by side, often separated by no more than a wall or an alleyway. The grand squares with their elegant townhouses looked out upon private gardens, while just behind them, in the mews and courts and narrow lanes, the working people lived and labored in conditions that the residents of those fine houses would scarcely have recognized. It was an era before the reforms that would later improve sanitation and housing and working conditions, an era when children worked long hours in dangerous trades, when disease spread easily through crowded neighborhoods, when the streets were thick with horse dung and coal smoke and the cries of hawkers selling their wares. And all of this was set against the backdrop of the great events unfolding across the Channel, the French Revolution and the wars that followed, the rise of Napoleon, the battles on land and sea that would shape the map of Europe and consume the energies and resources of Britain for more than 2 decades. The common people of London felt these events in the price of bread, in the taxes levied to pay for the war, in the sight of soldiers and sailors in the streets, in the anxious rumors of invasion that circulated from time to time. It was a world of uncertainty, and for a family like the Faradays, already struggling to make ends meet, the great movements of history were experienced not as grand narratives, but as immediate pressures on their daily existence. Michael's formal education was, by any measure, extremely limited. He attended what was called a common day school, a basic institution where children of the working poor received instruction in the most rudimentary elements of learning. There, Michael was taught to read, and to write, and to perform simple arithmetic, and not very much more than that. The schooling was brief and basic, and it gave him only the most elementary tools of literacy and numeracy, without any of the classical languages or higher mathematics or natural philosophy that children of more prosperous families might have encountered. He would later describe his education as consisting of little more than the rudiments of reading, writing, and arithmetic, and this was not false modesty but simple truth. There is, however, one incident from his schooling that has come down to us, an incident that speaks to the circumstances of his childhood and the character of his mother. Michael had a speech impediment when he was young, a difficulty with pronouncing the letter R, which came out in some other fashion, perhaps as a W or some other approximation, as is common enough in young children whose mouths and tongues are still learning the precise movements required for each sound. At the school he attended, this mispronunciation attracted the attention of a teacher, who responded not with patience or gentle correction but with a blow, striking the child for his failure to speak properly. When Margaret Faraday learned what had happened, she removed her son from that school, unwilling to leave him in a place where he would be treated so harshly for something that was not his fault and that he could not easily help. This small act of maternal protection tells us something about Margaret Faraday and about the values of the household in which Michael was raised. There was a dignity there, even in poverty, a sense that children deserved kindness and that cruelty was not to be tolerated simply because it came from a figure of authority. Michael would eventually overcome his speech difficulty, as most children do, and he would grow up to become a lecturer of remarkable clarity and presence, capable of holding audiences spellbound with his explanations of scientific phenomena. But that lay many years ahead, in a future that no one in Jacob's well-muse could have imagined. For now, in the closing years of the 18th century and the opening years of the 19th, young Michael Faraday was simply a boy of the London working class, growing up in modest rooms above a coach house, in a family held together by faith and by love and by the quiet determination to endure whatever hardships came their way. The great city moved around him, vast and noisy and indifferent, and the wars raged on across the sea, and the years passed in the ordinary rhythm of childhood, of small discoveries and simple pleasures, of learning to read and write and make one's way in the world. There was nothing in those early years to suggest that this child would one day transform our understanding of electricity and magnetism and light, nothing to hint at the extraordinary journey that lay ahead. He was simply Michael, the blacksmith's son, a boy with a speech impediment and a limited education, growing up in a time of war and scarcity, in a city that had no particular interest in his future and no reason to expect anything remarkable from him at all. In the year 1804, in the city of London, there lived a boy of 13 years named Michael Faraday, and this boy had been sent out from his family's modest lodgings to find work, as was the custom for children of working families in those times, and he found himself walking each day to a shop at No. 2 Blandford Street, near Manchester Square, where a French émigré named George Rebow kept a bookselling and bookbinding establishment, and it was here, in this quiet shop filled with the particular smell of paper and leather and binding glue, that the boy Michael began his working life as an errand boy, running messages through the London streets, delivering newspapers to subscribers, and performing whatever small tasks were required of him by his employer. George Rebow had come to England from France some years earlier, as many had done during the turbulent period of the Revolution, and he had established himself in this respectable trade of selling and binding books, and he was, by all accounts, a kind and perceptive man who took notice of the children and young people who worked for him, and who treated them with a gentleness that was not always common among employers of that era. And so young Michael found himself in a workplace that was, in its own quiet way, rather fortunate, though he could not have known at the time just how significant this particular shop would become in the unfolding of his life. For more than a year, Michael served as this errand boy, learning the rhythms of the shop, becoming familiar with the customers who came and went, watching the older apprentices at their work of folding pages and stitching bindings and pressing covers onto the books that passed through their hands. And during this time he observed everything with the quiet attentiveness that would later become one of his most noted characteristics. And he waited, as young people in such positions must wait, for the opportunity to advance to something more substantial. That opportunity came on the 7th day of October in the year 1805, when Michael Faraday, now 14 years of age, was formally apprenticed to George Rebow as a bookbinder, beginning a 7-year period of training that would occupy him until he reached the age of 21. And this apprenticeship, which was a common arrangement in those times, meant that he would live and work in close association with the Rebow household, learning every aspect of the bookbinding trade, from the simplest tasks of folding and cutting to the more skilled work of tooling leather covers and gilding spines with decorative lettering. The work of a bookbinder in the early 19th century was a craft that required patience and precision, and Michael learned to handle the various tools of the trade: the bone folders used for creasing paper, the awls for piercing holes through gathered signatures, the needles and strong linen thread for sewing, the heavy presses for flattening pages, and the finishing tools for impressing decorative patterns into leather. And he learned too the different types of binding suitable for different kinds of books, and the characteristics of various papers and leathers and cloths. And all of this learning happened gradually, day by day, in the unhurried manner of traditional craft apprenticeship. But what made the Reebau workshop particularly significant for young Michael was not merely the trade skills he acquired there, but rather the extraordinary access he was given to the contents of the books that passed through his hands. For George Reebau, observing that his young apprentice showed an unusual interest in reading and learning, encouraged him to look into the books that came to the shop for binding, and even permitted him to borrow volumes to read during his limited free time. And this encouragement, this simple kindness of allowing a working-class boy to read above his station, would prove to be one of the most consequential acts of generosity in the history of science. Among the many volumes that passed through the Blandford Street workshop during these years, there were two that would leave an especially deep impression upon the mind of the young apprentice. And the first of these was an article on electricity that appeared in the third edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, written by a Scottish writer named James Tytler. And this article, which Michael encountered while binding or rebinding a set of the Encyclopaedia, introduced him for the first time to the strange and wonderful phenomena associated with electrical force, the attraction and repulsion of charged objects, the spark that could be drawn from a rubbed glass rod, the mysterious fluid, as it was then conceived, that seemed to flow through certain substances and not through others. The article by James Tytler was written in the straightforward prose common to encyclopedia entries of that period, explaining the known facts about electricity as they were understood in the late 18th century, describing the experiments of earlier investigators, and setting forth the theoretical ideas that natural philosophers had proposed to account for electrical phenomena. And young Michael read this material with great attention, and something in the descriptions of these experiments, something in the careful explanations of how one might produce and observe electrical effects, stirred in him a curiosity that would never afterward leave him, and he found himself wanting not merely to read about these things but to see them for himself, to produce them with his own hands. The second book that would prove foundational to his development was a volume titled Conversations on Chemistry, written by a woman named Jane Marset and published in 1805, the very year that Michael's formal apprenticeship began. And this book was written in the form of dialogues between a fictional teacher named Mrs. Bryan and two young female students named Emily and Caroline. And through these conversations, the reader was introduced to the principles of chemistry as they were then understood, including the relatively new chemistry of Lavoisier with its careful attention to measurement and its systematic naming of substances. Jane Marset had written her book with the intention of making chemistry accessible to readers who had no previous scientific training, and she succeeded remarkably well in this aim, for her explanations were clear and patient, building up from simple observations to more complex ideas, and she described experiments that the reader might perform or at least imagine performing, and she connected the abstract principles of chemistry to everyday phenomena that anyone might observe. And for Michael Faraday, who had no formal education beyond the rudiments of reading and writing and arithmetic learned at a dame school in his childhood, this book opened a door into a world of systematic knowledge that he had not previously known existed. In later years, long after he had become one of the most celebrated natural philosophers of his age, Faraday would look back upon these two works, the Encyclopedia article and the Conversations on Chemistry, as foundational influences upon his intellectual development, and he would express particular gratitude toward Jane Marset, whose book had shown him that the natural world could be understood through careful observation and reasoned analysis, and that such understanding was not the exclusive province of those born to wealth and education, but was available to anyone willing to apply themselves with patience and attention. But Michael Faraday was not content merely to read about scientific phenomena, for he possessed from an early age a practical inclination, a desire to work with his hands. And so he began, in the back room of the Blandford street shop, to attempt some experiments of his own, using whatever materials he could obtain cheaply or salvage from discarded items. And among his early projects was the construction of a crude electrostatic generator, built from old glass bottles and pieces of scrap wood, with which he could produce small electrical charges and observe for himself the attractions and repulsions and sparks that he had read about in the encyclopedia article. The construction of such a device required ingenuity and patience, for Michael had no access to the proper apparatus that a wealthy gentleman might purchase from an instrument maker, and so he had to improvise, finding ways to create the necessary components from whatever came to hand, using a glass bottle in place of a proper glass sphere or cylinder, rigging up some mechanism to rotate it, and arranging strips of metal or other conducting materials to collect the charge that built up on the glass surface when it was rubbed. And though his apparatus was crude by the standards of proper scientific instruments, it worked well enough to produce the effects he wished to observe, and this was sufficient for his purposes. He performed electrochemical experiments as well, using simple batteries constructed according to the designs he had read about, decomposing water into its component gases and watching the tiny bubbles rise from the electrodes. And in all of these activities he was teaching himself not only the facts of natural philosophy but also the methods by which such facts could be discovered, learning through his own experience that knowledge of nature came not from authority or tradition but from careful observation of what actually happened when one performed an experiment. During these years of his apprenticeship, Michael became aware that there existed in London various societies and lecture series where natural philosophy was discussed and demonstrated, and in the year 1810, when he was 19 years of age, he began attending lectures given by a man named John Tatum at an establishment called the City Philosophical Society, which met at various locations in the city, and these lectures covered topics in natural philosophy, including electricity and chemistry and other subjects that greatly interested the young bookbinder. Attendance at these lectures required payment of 1 shilling per lecture, which was a not insignificant sum for a young apprentice of very limited means, and the money for these lectures was provided by Michael's elder brother Robert, a blacksmith who recognized his younger brother's unusual abilities and wished to help him develop them. And this act of fraternal generosity, this willingness to spend hard-earned wages so that a younger sibling might attend scientific lectures, was another of those small kindnesses that helped to shape the course of Faraday's life, and he would remember it with gratitude in later years. At the City Philosophical Society, Michael not only listened to lectures but also met other young men who shared his interest in natural philosophy and self-improvement. And among these new acquaintances was a young man named Benjamin Abbott, with whom he formed a friendship that would prove both lasting and intellectually fruitful. And the two young men began exchanging letters in which they discussed scientific topics and encouraged one another in their studies. And these letters, some of which have survived, show Faraday in the process of developing his thinking and his powers of expression, working out his ideas in writing and submitting them to the friendly criticism of a sympathetic correspondent. Together with Abbott and several other young men of similar inclinations, Michael formed what might be called a mutual improvement group, an informal association for the purpose of self-education and intellectual development, and the members of this group would meet to discuss what they had read, to share their observations and ideas, and to help one another advance in knowledge. And such groups were not uncommon in that era among young working people who wished to better themselves but had no access to formal educational institutions, and they represented a form of democratic education that operated outside the established structures of schools and universities. Throughout these years, Michael developed a systematic approach to his own education that would serve him well for the remainder of his life. And this system involved the careful taking of notes during lectures and while reading, followed by the rewriting and organizing of these notes into a more coherent form, and finally the binding of the revised notes into proper books, using the very skills he was learning in his apprenticeship, so that his craft and his studies became intertwined, each serving the other. This practice of making notes, revising them, and binding them into books was more than merely a method of organizing information, for it required him to actively engage with the material he was learning, to think about how ideas related to one another, to express things in his own words rather than simply copying what others had written. And in this way the process of note-taking and revision became itself a form of learning, a way of processing and internalizing knowledge that went far beyond passive reading. The bound volumes of notes that resulted from this practice became his personal library of scientific knowledge, organized according to his own understanding and always available for reference and review, and they represented the tangible product of his years of self-education, evidence of the seriousness and dedication with which he had pursued his studies, and they would later serve as a kind of credential, demonstrating to those who might doubt the abilities of a self-taught bookbinder that he had indeed acquired substantial knowledge of natural philosophy through his own efforts. And so the years of apprenticeship passed, one after another, in the quiet routine of the Blandford street shop, and Michael Faraday grew from a boy of 14 into a young man approaching the age of 21, when his formal apprenticeship would end. And during all these years he continued his double life as both a working craftsman and a student of nature, binding books by day and reading them by night, attending lectures when he could afford them, corresponding with friends about scientific matters, and slowly, steadily, building up the foundation of knowledge and skill upon which his future achievements would rest. In the early months of 1812, as the cold of an English winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the streets of London, a young bookbinder's apprentice named Michael Faraday was approaching the final year of his formal indenture to George Rebar, the kindly bookseller on Blandford Street. Faraday had spent nearly 7 years now in the shop, binding volumes and learning his trade with quiet diligence, and in the evenings and spare moments between his duties, he had continued his private education in the sciences, reading whatever volumes passed through his hands and attending the weekly meetings of the City Philosophical Society whenever he could manage to do so. He was 20 years old, still uncertain of how he might transform his growing love of natural philosophy into something more than a private hobby, when a small act of generosity from a customer would set into motion a series of events that would alter the entire course of his life. Among the regular patrons of Rebar's shop was a gentleman named William Dance, a member of the Royal Institution who had become aware of the young apprentice's unusual interests through conversations with Rebar himself, who was always proud to speak of Faraday's self-directed studies and his careful experiments conducted in the small room above the shop. Dance was a man of some means and connection, and he had recently come into possession of tickets to a series of lectures being delivered at the Royal Institution by Sir Humphry Davy, who was at that time perhaps the most celebrated scientist in all of England. Davy was known throughout Europe for his discoveries of new chemical elements, for his invention of the miner's safety lamp, and for his theatrical and compelling style of public lecturing, which drew fashionable crowds to the great lecture theatre on Albemarle Street. These particular lectures were to be among Davy's final public presentations before he stepped back from regular lecturing duties, and Dance, thinking of the eager young bookbinder with his homemade scientific instruments and his endless questions about chemistry, decided that Faraday ought to have the opportunity to see the great man speak. And so it was that in February of 1812, Michael Faraday found himself walking through the grand entrance of the Royal Institution for the first time, clutching a ticket that admitted him to the lecture theatre where Davy would hold forth on the subject of chemistry. The building itself must have seemed rather magnificent to a young man who had spent most of his life in modest circumstances, with its classical facade and its reputation as the foremost centre of scientific research in the nation. Faraday attended all 4 of the lectures for which Dance had provided tickets, sitting in the audience and listening with the most intense concentration as Davy spoke of acids and bases, of combustion and chemical affinity, of the hidden forces that govern the behavior of matter. Unlike many in the audience who came as much for entertainment as for instruction, Faraday approached these lectures as a student would, taking careful notes and committing every detail he could to memory. What Faraday did with these notes in the weeks that followed reveals much about his character and his method of learning. Rather than simply keeping his scribbled observations in a private notebook, he set about transforming them into something far more substantial, drawing upon all the skills he had developed during his years as a bookbinder's apprentice. He wrote out his notes in a fair hand, expanding upon them where his memory and additional reading allowed, and he illustrated them with careful diagrams showing the experimental apparatus Davy had demonstrated. When he had finished, he bound the pages himself into a proper volume, a handsome book of 386 pages that represented not only the content of Davy's lectures but also the craftsmanship and dedication of the young man who had created it. This bound notebook was a labor of love, a physical manifestation of Faraday's desire to be taken seriously as a student of science, and he would soon put it to a purpose that required no small amount of courage for someone of his humble station. In June of 1812, as Faraday contemplated the approaching end of his apprenticeship and the prospect of spending the rest of his days as a journeyman bookbinder, he took the rather bold step of writing a letter to Sir Joseph Banks, who was then the president of the Royal Society and one of the most influential figures in British science. In this letter, Faraday expressed his earnest wish to escape from trade and to enter into scientific employment of some kind, hoping that a man of Banks's position might know of an opportunity suitable for a young person of limited means but genuine enthusiasm for natural philosophy. He posted the letter and waited for a response that never came. Banks, elderly and occupied with the many demands upon his attention, apparently did not feel moved to reply to this unknown apprentice, and the silence that followed must have been a disappointment to Faraday, though he seems to have accepted it without bitterness. He had tried, and he would have to find another way. The autumn of 1812 brought significant changes to Faraday's circumstances. On the 7th of October, his formal apprenticeship to Rebow came to an end, and he was now a fully trained bookbinder free to seek employment as a journeyman in the trade. He found a position with a bookseller named Henri de la Roche, a French émigré whose shop was located on King Street, and Faraday began working there, binding books and performing the duties expected of him. By all accounts, this was not a happy arrangement. De la Roche was a difficult employer, and the atmosphere of the shop was far less congenial than the one Faraday had known under Rebow's kindly supervision. The work was the same work Faraday had always done, but now it felt more oppressive, more confining, and he seems to have regarded this period as one of genuine unhappiness, trapped in a trade he wished to leave but unable to see a clear path toward anything better. Meanwhile, fate was preparing an unexpected intervention. In October of 1812, Sir Humphrey Davy was conducting experiments with nitrogen trichloride, a volatile and dangerous compound, when a sudden explosion sent glass and chemicals into his face, temporarily damaging his eyes and leaving him unable to read or write for a period of several weeks. Davy needed assistance with his correspondence and his scientific notes, someone to serve as an amanuensis who could write at his dictation and read aloud to him while his eyes healed, and through some connection that the historical record does not fully explain, Faraday was recommended for this temporary position. It is possible that Rebaum mentioned his former apprentice to someone who mentioned him to Davy, or perhaps the bound volume of lecture notes had made some impression after all. However it came about, Faraday found himself employed for a few days in the direct service of the man whose lectures had so inspired him, writing letters and taking notes as Davy directed and catching a glimpse of what life in the scientific world might actually be like. When Davy's eyes healed and the temporary employment ended, Faraday returned to his unhappy position with de la Roche, but he did not abandon hope. Remembering his bound volume of lecture notes, he decided to send it directly to Davy along with a letter expressing his desire to leave trade and enter into scientific work. Davy received the volume and was apparently impressed by both its contents and its craftsmanship, and he responded with words of encouragement, though he advised Faraday that science was a harsh mistress who paid poorly and that the young man might do better to stick with his trade. This was well-meaning advice from a man who had himself struggled in his early career, but it was not the advice Faraday was prepared to follow. On the 1st of March, 1813, the situation changed dramatically. A laboratory assistant at the Royal Institution named William Payne had been dismissed from his position following a physical altercation with the instrument maker, a violation of the institution's rules that could not be overlooked, and suddenly there was a vacancy on the staff. Davy thought of the earnest young bookbinder who had sent him that remarkable volume of notes, and he offered Faraday the position of chemical assistant in the laboratory. The salary was 25 shillings per week, which was actually less than Faraday had been earning as a bookbinder. But the position came with 2 small rooms in the attic of the Royal Institution where Faraday could live, and more importantly, it offered him entry into the world he had dreamed of joining. He accepted without hesitation and began his duties at the institution that had seemed so grand when he had first walked through its doors as a guest holding a ticket to Davy's lectures. Later that same year, in October of 1813, an opportunity arose that would take Faraday far from London and give him an education that no book could provide. Davy had received permission from the French government to travel to the continent despite the ongoing Napoleonic Wars, a diplomatic courtesy extended to a scientist of his international reputation, and he planned an extended tour of Europe with his wife, the former Jane Apprentice, a wealthy widow he had married just 2 years before. Davy asked Faraday to accompany them as his scientific assistant, to help with experiments and observations they might conduct along the way, and Faraday agreed to go, though the arrangement would prove to be more complicated than he had anticipated. The difficulty arose from the fact that Davy's regular valet refused to travel abroad, uncomfortable with the prospect of journeying through war-torn Europe, and no suitable replacement had been found before the departure date. Lady Davy, who possessed a sharp tongue and a keen sense of social hierarchy, seemed to regard Faraday not as a scientific colleague of her husband, but as a servant who ought to make himself useful in whatever capacity was required. Throughout the tour, Faraday found himself called upon to perform the duties of a valet in addition to his scientific work, attending to matters of luggage and personal service that he found humiliating and degrading. Lady Davy treated him with a coldness that bordered on contempt, and though Davy himself was generally kind, he did not always intervene to protect his assistant from his wife's condescension. Faraday bore this treatment with patience, reminding himself of the extraordinary opportunity he had been given and the scientific wonders he was witnessing. And there were indeed wonders to witness. The party travelled first to Paris, where Faraday was present when Davy met with some of the leading scientists of France, including André-Marie Ampère, who would later become famous for his work on electromagnetism, and Joseph Louis Gay-Lussac, known for his discoveries about the behavior of gases. These were men whose names Faraday had encountered in his reading, and now he was in the same room with them, observing their conversations and their methods. From France, the party continued to Italy, where Davy conducted experiments in Florence using the great burning lens of the Grand Duke to analyze the composition of diamond, demonstrating that it was made entirely of carbon. In Milan, they visited Alessandro Volta, the inventor of the electric battery, now elderly and retired but still a figure of legend in the scientific world. Faraday, who had built his own simple batteries following instructions from books, stood in the presence of the man who had created the first reliable source of continuous electrical current. The tour continued through Switzerland and other parts of Europe, with Faraday assisting in experiments and observations wherever Davy's curiosity led them. And despite the social humiliations he endured, the young man absorbed everything he could from the experience. He saw how scientific work was conducted at the highest levels, how apparatus was designed and experiments were carried out, how results were interpreted and communicated to the wider world. When the party finally returned to England in April of 1815, Faraday had been transformed from a bookbinder with scientific hobbies into something closer to a proper scientific apprentice, ready to begin the work that would eventually make his own name known throughout the world. And so we return now to the Royal Institution, that quiet building on Albemarle Street where Michael Faraday had first arrived as a bookbinder's apprentice, carrying his handmade notebook of lecture observations and hoping only for a glimpse of the scientific world that had so captured his imagination. The year was 1815, and the circumstances of his return were considerably different from those of his departure some 2 years earlier, when he had set off across war-torn Europe as Sir Humphrey Davy's assistant and general helper. Now he came back not as a temporary employee engaged for a continental tour, but as a permanent member of the institution staff, with a raised salary that reflected his growing capabilities and the value that Davy and others had come to place upon his careful, methodical work. The position carried the title of assistant and superintendent of the apparatus of the laboratory and the mineralogical collection, which was quite a lengthy designation for what amounted to the role of keeping the institution's scientific equipment in good working order and maintaining its collection of mineral specimens in a state suitable for study and demonstration. His salary had been increased to 30 shillings per week, along with the continuation of his rooms at the top of the building, where the light came in through high windows and where he could hear the sounds of Albemarle Street below, the passing of carriages and the quiet conversations of pedestrians making their way through this respectable quarter of London. The work that occupied Faraday during these years was largely directed by Davy himself, who remained the institution's most prominent figure and who continued to pursue his own extensive researches into the nature of chemical substances and their various combinations. Under Davy's direction, Faraday found himself engaged in the systematic investigation of numerous chemical questions, working long hours in the basement laboratory where apparatus of glass and metal stood ready for experiments, and where the smell of various substances hung in the air, sometimes pleasant, sometimes rather less so. Among the investigations that occupied his attention during this period was the study of chlorine compounds, those combinations of the yellowish-green gas that had been isolated some years earlier and which continued to present interesting questions about the nature of chemical combination and the ways in which different elements might join together to form new substances with properties quite unlike those of their constituent parts. Chlorine itself was a disagreeable substance to work with, being harsh upon the throat and damaging to the delicate tissues of the lungs if breathed in any quantity. And Faraday learned through careful practice how to handle it safely, how to contain it within sealed vessels, and how to combine it with other substances under controlled conditions. The work on steel alloys represented another significant strand of his research during this time, undertaken in collaboration with a skilled cutler named James Stoddart, who brought to the partnership his practical knowledge of metalworking and his particular interest in the improvement of razor steel. The aim of their joint investigation was to understand whether the addition of various metals to iron might produce alloys with superior properties for cutting instruments, and they experimented with combinations involving platinum, silver, rhodium, and other elements, carefully recording the results and attempting to correlate the composition of each alloy with its hardness, its ability to take and hold a sharp edge, and its resistance to corrosion and wear. This collaborative work with Stoddart continued through 1818 and into 1819, with the two men producing numerous experimental alloys and subjecting them to various tests. The results were not always encouraging, for the science of metallurgy remained imperfectly understood, and many combinations that seemed promising on theoretical grounds proved disappointing in practice, the resulting metal being too brittle, or too soft, or otherwise unsuitable for the demanding work of shaving a gentleman's face without leaving it raw and irritated. Yet the investigation was valuable nonetheless, for it added to the growing body of knowledge about the behavior of metals and their combinations, and it gave Faraday experience in a systematic approach to experimental investigation that would serve him well in later years. In 1816, Faraday achieved a milestone that marked his formal entry into the community of published scientific authors, when his first scientific paper appeared in the Quarterly Journal of Science. The subject of this paper was an analysis of native caustic lime from Tuscany, a mineral specimen that had come to the institution and which presented interesting questions about its composition and origin. The paper itself was a modest contribution, carefully written and thoroughly documented, presenting the results of his chemical analysis in the measured language appropriate to scientific communication. It was not a revolutionary discovery, nor did it overturn any established theories, but it demonstrated that Faraday could conduct original research and communicate his findings in a manner acceptable to the scientific community, and it bore his name alone, establishing him as an independent contributor to scientific knowledge, rather than merely an assistant carrying out the directions of others. The analysis of the Tuscan lime involved the careful application of techniques that Faraday had learned during his years at the institution, the use of reagents to test for the presence of various substances, the measurement of quantities and proportions, and the logical interpretation of results to draw conclusions about the nature of the specimen under investigation. Such work required patience and precision, qualities that Faraday possessed in abundance, and a willingness to repeat experiments multiple times to ensure that results were reliable and not the product of some accidental contamination or procedural error. The Royal Institution had long maintained a tradition of public lectures, bringing the discoveries and debates of science to audiences of educated men and women who gathered in the institution's lecture theatre to hear the leading figures of the day explain their work. Among these lecture series were the Friday evening discourses, which had been established as a regular feature of the institution's program and which brought together speakers on a wide range of scientific and cultural topics. In January of 1816, Faraday was invited to participate in this series, delivering his first formal lecture at the institution and thus beginning what would become a lifelong association with the art of scientific communication. The experience of standing before an audience and explaining scientific matters in clear and engaging terms was one that might have daunted a young man of limited formal education and humble origins, Yet Faraday approached it with the same careful preparation that he brought to his laboratory work, studying the techniques of effective speaking and practicing the delivery of his material until he felt confident in his ability to convey his meaning clearly. The success of this first lecture encouraged him to continue developing his skills as a public communicator of science, a role that would eventually bring him considerable fame and which would shape the institution's identity in ways that extended far beyond his own lifetime. The year 1820 brought with it a significant achievement in Faraday's chemical researches, when he succeeded in producing the first known compounds of carbon and chlorine, substances that had not previously been isolated or described. These compounds, which would later be named hexachloroethane and tetrachloroethane according to the systematic nomenclature of chemistry, represented genuine additions to the catalogue of known substances, new combinations of matter that expanded the boundaries of chemical knowledge. The work required considerable skill in handling the reactive substances involved, and in isolating the products of the reactions in a state pure enough to allow their properties to be determined with confidence. The production of these carbon-chlorine compounds was accomplished through methods that Faraday developed and refined through patient experimentation, learning how to control the conditions of the reactions and how to separate the desired products from the mixture of substances that resulted. Such work was often tedious and sometimes hazardous, requiring long hours in the laboratory and careful attention to the details of procedure. Yet Faraday found in it a deep satisfaction, the pleasure of uncovering new facts about the natural world and of contributing, however modestly, to the great edifice of scientific understanding. Among the practical contributions that emerged from Faraday's laboratory work during this period was the development of a modified design for a gas burner, an improvement upon existing apparatus that provided a more controllable and efficient flame for laboratory use. This device, which may be regarded as a precursor to the familiar Bunsen burner that would later become standard equipment in laboratories throughout the world, allowed the experimenter to adjust the mixture of gas and air feeding the flame, thereby controlling its temperature and character to suit the requirements of different experimental procedures. Such practical improvements in laboratory equipment were essential to the progress of experimental science, for the quality of apparatus directly affected the precision and reliability of experimental results. The question of the miner's safety lamp drew Faraday into a delicate situation that required not only scientific analysis but also considerable diplomatic skill. Sir Humphrey Davy had developed a lamp designed to provide illumination for coal miners, while preventing the ignition of the explosive gases that accumulated in mines and which had caused so many tragic accidents over the years. However, George Stephenson, an engineer from the north of England who would later achieve fame for his work on railways, had independently developed a similar device, and a controversy arose over the question of priority and credit for the invention. Faraday was called upon to analyze the principles of the safety lamp and to assist Davy in responding to the competing claims. His handling of this sensitive matter demonstrated a quality that would characterize his approach to scientific disputes throughout his career, namely a focus on the facts and principles at issue rather than on personalities or questions of prestige. He conducted his analysis carefully and reported his findings clearly, while avoiding any unnecessary provocation of those who supported Stephenson's claims. The controversy itself remained unresolved to the satisfaction of all parties, as such disputes often do, but Faraday emerged from it with his reputation for integrity and careful work intact. During these years, Faraday developed friendships that extended beyond the immediate circle of scientific practitioners at the Royal Institution, connections that enriched his life and broadened his perspectives. Among these friends was John Martin, an artist whose dramatic paintings of biblical and historical subjects brought him considerable fame, and whose company Faraday found stimulating and agreeable. The friendship between the scientist and the artist might seem surprising to those who view these two realms of human endeavor as entirely separate. Yet both men were engaged in the work of observation and representation, of seeing the world clearly and conveying what they saw to others. Another friendship of this period was that with Edward McGrath, a man of scientific interests who shared Faraday's enthusiasm for investigation and discussion. Such friendships provided Faraday with opportunities for conversation and intellectual exchange outside the formal settings of lectures and laboratory work, and they helped to sustain him through the long hours of careful experimental labor that occupied so much of his time. As Faraday's reputation grew, so too did the demands upon his time and expertise from those who wished to benefit from his analytical skills and scientific knowledge. He participated in geological expeditions and undertook consulting work for various clients who required the services of a competent chemist to analyze substances or solve practical problems. These engagements brought him into contact with a wider range of scientific questions and practical challenges, and they provided additional income to supplement his salary from the institution. The geological expeditions took him into the countryside, away from the smoky air of London and into landscapes where the rocks themselves told stories of ancient processes and transformations. Faraday's careful eye for observation and his methodical approach to investigation made him a valuable participant in these expeditions, and the specimens he collected and analyzed added to the growing understanding of the composition of the British landscape. Through all of this activity, Faraday maintained his careful habits of documentation, recording his experiments, his observations, and his thoughts in notebooks that would eventually fill many volumes. These records served not only as aids to memory but as a discipline of thought, forcing him to articulate clearly what he had done and what he had observed, and to consider carefully the meaning of his results. The habit of clear and thorough documentation, established during these early years of his scientific career, would prove invaluable throughout his life. And so the years from 1815 to 1821 saw Michael Faraday develop from a promising assistant into a recognized contributor to scientific knowledge, a man whose name appeared in the scientific journals and whose opinions were sought by those with practical problems to solve. The foundations of his scientific career were being laid, stone by careful stone, in the quiet laboratory at the Royal Institution where the work of investigation continued day after day, experiment following experiment in the patient pursuit of understanding. In the early summer of 1821, Michael Faraday found himself standing at the threshold of what would become one of the most quietly transformative periods of his life, a season marked not by the dramatic upheavals that sometimes accompany great change, but rather by a gentle settling into patterns that would sustain him for decades to come. On the 12th of June, in the modest church of St. Faith in the Virgin in Marylebone, he married Sarah Barnard, a young woman he had come to know through the close-knit community of Sandemanian worshippers to which both families belonged. Sarah was the daughter of Edward Barnard, a silversmith by trade, and she brought to the marriage a temperament well suited to the particular rhythms of a life devoted to scientific inquiry, being herself possessed of patience, steadiness, and a calm disposition that complemented her husband's intense periods of concentration and occasional spells of exhaustion. The wedding was a simple affair, as befitted the Sandemanian tradition that both Michael and Sarah held dear, a faith that valued humility and discouraged outward displays of wealth or status. The congregation to which they belonged met in small gatherings, read scripture together, and observed a literal interpretation of biblical teachings that included the washing of feet and the sharing of simple meals. This religious foundation would remain central to Faraday throughout his life, providing him with a framework of meaning that existed quite separately from his scientific work, though both pursuits shared a common thread of reverent attention to the workings of the natural world. Following their marriage, Michael and Sarah took up residence at the Royal Institution itself, occupying rooms within that grand building on Albemarle Street where Faraday had first arrived as a young bookbinder's apprentice seeking nothing more than a chance to attend a few lectures. Now he was a permanent fixture of the establishment, and the rooms they inhabited would remain their home for the next 46 years, a period during which Sarah would provide the domestic stability that allowed her husband to pursue his investigations with singular focus. Their marriage would prove to be childless, a circumstance that might have brought sorrow to some couples, but which Michael and Sarah seemed to have accepted with the quiet equanimity that characterized their partnership in all things. What they shared instead was a devotion to one another that visitors often remarked upon, a tenderness that expressed itself in small daily kindnesses rather than grand gestures, and a companionship that deepened with each passing year rather than diminishing. Sarah understood, perhaps better than anyone else could have, the particular demands that scientific work placed upon her husband, the way he would become absorbed in a problem for hours or even days at a time, the periods of intense productivity followed by intervals of necessary rest, and the emotional toll that both success and controversy could exact upon a sensitive temperament. She created for him a haven of domestic peace within the bustling institution, managing their household with quiet efficiency and providing the kind of steadfast support that required no acknowledgement because it was simply woven into the fabric of their daily existence. It was in September of that same year, just 3 months after his wedding, that Faraday made a discovery that would establish his reputation as an original investigator of the first rank and simultaneously plunge him into one of the most painful controversies of his career. The phenomenon he observed was what we now call electromagnetic rotation, and it represented the first demonstration of continuous mechanical motion produced by electrical and magnetic forces, the foundational principle upon which all electric motors would eventually be built. The discovery arose from Faraday's careful study of work that had been published the previous year by the Danish natural philosopher Hans Christian Ørsted, who had shown that an electric current flowing through a wire could deflect a magnetic compass needle positioned nearby. This observation had excited considerable interest throughout the scientific community, for it suggested a previously unsuspected connection between electricity and magnetism, two phenomena that had long been studied as entirely separate branches of natural philosophy. Various investigators had attempted to understand and extend Ørsted's findings, including William Hyde Wollaston, a highly respected English scientist who had visited the Royal Institution and discussed with Humphrey Davy his idea that a current-carrying wire might be made to rotate on its own axis when placed near a magnetic pole. Faraday, having been present during some of these discussions and having read widely about the various attempts to understand electromagnetic phenomena, set about his own investigations with characteristic thoroughness. Working in his small laboratory at the Royal Institution, he constructed a simple but ingenious apparatus consisting of a small container of mercury, a permanent magnet fixed upright in the center, and a wire that was free to move while remaining in electrical contact with the mercury. When he passed a current through the wire, he observed something remarkable. The wire began to rotate continuously around the magnet, tracing endless circles through the mercury as long as the current continued to flow. He then constructed a complementary apparatus in which the magnet itself was free to move while the wire remained fixed, and observed the reciprocal effect, the magnet rotating steadily around the stationary wire. This was not the axial rotation that Wollaston had hypothesized, but rather a continuous circular motion around an axis, and Faraday recognized immediately that he had demonstrated something of profound importance. He had shown that electrical and magnetic forces could produce perpetual mechanical rotation, converting the invisible flow of electric current into visible, sustained movement. The implications were enormous, though their full practical realization would take many years and many hands to achieve. In his enthusiasm, Faraday published his findings rapidly in the Quarterly Journal of Science, eager to share the discovery with the broader scientific community. However, in his haste, he made an omission that would cause him considerable anguish. He failed to adequately acknowledge the prior speculations of Wollaston and the discussions that had taken place at the Royal Institution before his experiments. This oversight, though unintentional, gave rise to accusations that Faraday had appropriated ideas that properly belonged to others, accusations that wounded him deeply because they struck at the very core of his self-conception as an honest and honourable man. Wollaston himself, upon learning of the situation, behaved with considerable generosity, accepting Faraday's explanations and apologies without rancour. But others were less forgiving, and rumours of impropriety circulated through the scientific community with a persistence that caused Faraday great distress. He attempted to set the record straight through personal visits and written explanations, and eventually the controversy subsided among most of those involved. But the episode left scars on Faraday's sensitive nature, teaching him a painful lesson about the importance of careful acknowledgement and the treacherous currents that could flow beneath the surface of scientific collegiality. More troubling still was the effect of this controversy on his relationship with Humphrey Davy, the man who had given him his start at the Royal Institution and whom Faraday had long regarded with something approaching filial devotion. Davy's response to his former assistant's growing independence and originality was complex and not entirely creditable, revealing a strain of jealousy that perhaps surprised even Davy himself. Where once he had championed Faraday's talents and promoted his advancement, he now seemed to view the younger man's successes with a mixture of pride and resentment that must have been deeply confusing to Faraday, who had never sought anything but to honour his mentor's legacy. The tension between them would come to a painful head in January of 1824, when Faraday's name was put forward for election to the Royal Society, that most prestigious of scientific bodies whose fellowship represented the highest recognition the British scientific establishment could bestow. Davy, who was then serving as president of the Royal Society, actively opposed the nomination, urging Faraday to withdraw his name and making clear his disapproval of the entire proceeding. Some accounts suggest that Davy questioned whether Faraday's discoveries were sufficiently original to merit such recognition, while others indicate that the lingering controversy over the electromagnetic rotation discovery played a role in his opposition. Faraday, caught between his genuine respect for Davy and his equally genuine belief that his work merited recognition, found himself in an agonizing position. He chose not to withdraw, and on the 8th of January 1824, the Fellows of the Royal Society cast their votes. When the ballots were counted, Faraday had been elected, with only a single vote recorded against him. That solitary dissenting vote was cast by Humphrey Davy, his former patron, his mentor, the man who had once plucked him from obscurity and set his feet upon the path of scientific discovery. The wound this inflicted upon Faraday can hardly be overstated, though he bore it with characteristic dignity and never spoke publicly against Davy even after the latter's death a few years later. But the relationship between them was irrevocably altered, and Faraday was left to navigate the complex emotions of gratitude for past kindness mingled with hurt at present betrayal. It is one of the quieter tragedies of scientific history that two such remarkable men, bound together by so much shared experience, should have ended their association on such painful terms. The controversy over priority claims had actually begun even earlier, with the liquefaction of chlorine in 1823, an achievement that demonstrated Faraday's growing experimental sophistication and his ability to work at the very frontiers of physical investigation. By subjecting chlorine gas to high pressures at low temperatures, Faraday succeeded in converting it from its gaseous state into a liquid, a transformation that had significant implications for understanding the nature of matter and the conditions under which substances might change from one state to another. However, when news of this achievement began to circulate, Davy initially claimed a share of the credit, suggesting that the fundamental idea had been his and that Faraday had merely executed the experimental work. This was a painful blow to Faraday, who believed rightly that the conception and execution of the experiments had been primarily his own work. Over time, Davy moderated his claims and acknowledged Faraday's contribution more fairly, but the episode added another layer of complexity to their increasingly strained relationship. Emboldened by his success with chlorine, Faraday turned his attention to other gases, methodically investigating the conditions under which they too might be liquefied. Through patient experimentation involving various combinations of pressure and temperature, he succeeded in liquefying ammonia, that pungent substance familiar to anyone who has encountered smelling salts or certain cleaning solutions. He also liquefied carbon dioxide, the gas that we exhale with every breath and that gives effervescence to carbonated beverages, and hydrogen sulfide, the compound responsible for the distinctive odor of rotten eggs. Each successful liquefaction added to the body of knowledge about the behavior of matter under extreme conditions and helped establish general principles that would guide future investigators. In 1825, Faraday made another discovery of lasting importance, one that would prove essential to the development of the chemical industry and our understanding of organic compounds. While investigating the residues left behind from the production of oil gas, a form of illuminating gas produced by the destructive distillation of whale oil and used for lighting, he isolated a previously unknown substance with distinctive properties. This substance was a clear liquid with a characteristic sweet smell, and Faraday, analyzing its composition with the techniques available to him, determined that it consisted of carbon and hydrogen in a specific ratio. He named this new compound bicarburet of hydrogen, a designation that reflected the chemical nomenclature of his time and the understanding that the substance contained twice as much carbon relative to hydrogen as certain other known compounds. We know it today as benzene, and it would prove to be one of the most important compounds in all of organic chemistry, the parent substance of an entire family of aromatic compounds that includes toluene, phenol, and countless other substances essential to modern industry. Benzene derivatives are found in plastics, pharmaceuticals, dyes, detergents, and innumerable other products, though Faraday could not have foreseen these applications when he carefully distilled and analyzed the oily residues in his laboratory at the Royal Institution. Also in 1825 came formal recognition of Faraday's administrative as well as scientific capabilities, when he was appointed director of the laboratory at the Royal Institution. This position gave him authority over the day-to-day operations of the research facilities and recognized his central role in the institution's scientific activities. It was a responsibility he discharged with characteristic conscientiousness, ensuring that the laboratory remained well-equipped and that the tradition of rigorous experimental investigation continued to flourish. As the year drew to a close, Michael Faraday could look back upon a period of remarkable achievement and equally remarkable tribulation. He had married the woman who would be his devoted companion for nearly half a century, had made discoveries that established his reputation as one of the foremost experimental philosophers of his generation, had been elected to the Royal Society despite the opposition of its president, and had assumed new responsibilities at the institution that had become his permanent home. The controversies that had caused him such anguish would gradually fade, though their memory would never entirely leave him, and he would carry forward a heightened awareness of the importance of proper acknowledgement and the fragility of scientific friendships. The rooms he shared with Sarah in Albemarle Street would witness many more years of quiet industry and gentle domestic contentment, the rhythms of their life together punctuated by the steady accumulation of experimental knowledge and the gradual deepening of mutual affection. And though the wounds inflicted by the priority disputes would take time to heal, Faraday's essential nature remained unchanged, still curious, still meticulous, still driven by that profound desire to understand the hidden workings of the natural world that had first drawn him to science as a young bookbinder reading the pages he was meant only to bind. And now we come to a period in Michael Faraday's life that would quietly change the course of human history, though at the time it appeared simply as another series of careful experiments conducted in his basement laboratory at the Royal Institution, with coils of wire and iron rings and the soft tick of a galvanometer needle moving across its dial in the lamplight. The year 1831 began with Faraday continuing his various investigations, still occupied with the manufacture of optical glass and other duties that filled his days. But by the summer months he had returned to a question that had lingered in his mind for nearly a decade, ever since Hans Christian Ørsted had demonstrated that an electric current could deflect a compass needle, showing that electricity and magnetism were somehow related. And Faraday had wondered, with that patient curiosity of his, whether the relationship might work in the other direction as well, whether magnetism could somehow give rise to electricity. And many scientists had attempted this very thing without success, passing magnets near wires and finding nothing. And so the question remained open, like a door that everyone had tried but no one had managed to pass through. On the 29th of August, 1831, Faraday began an experiment using an iron ring, about 6 inches in diameter, which he had wound carefully with 2 separate coils of copper wire, one coil on each side of the ring, the coils wrapped in calico and string to keep them insulated from one another and from the iron itself. And this simple object, assembled with his own hands from ordinary materials, would later become known as the induction ring, and it was the instrument of one of the most significant discoveries in the history of science, though on that August morning it was simply a ring of iron with wire wrapped around it, sitting on a workbench in a basement room. Faraday connected one coil to a battery and the other coil to a galvanometer, which is a sensitive instrument for detecting small electric currents, and he observed something quite unexpected, for when he connected the battery, completing the circuit through the first coil, the galvanometer needle gave a brief deflection, a small twitch to one side, and then settled back to its resting position, and when he disconnected the battery, breaking the circuit, the needle deflected again, but this time in the opposite direction, before returning once more to rest. And this was curious indeed, for it meant that a current was being induced in the second coil, not when a steady current flowed in the first coil, but only when the current in the first coil was changing, starting or stopping, and this was the key that unlocked the door. He recorded this observation in his laboratory notebook, as was his careful habit, and in the days and weeks that followed he pursued this discovery with methodical patience, varying the conditions of the experiment, changing the size of the coils and the strength of the battery, testing whether the effect depended on the iron ring or whether it would occur with air between the coils, building up a complete picture of this new phenomenon through systematic investigation, never rushing ahead to conclusions but allowing the evidence to accumulate, one experiment at a time, like bricks being laid in a wall that would eventually form a structure of understanding. By October of 1831, Faraday had extended his investigations to include permanent magnets as well as electromagnets, and he made another fundamental observation, finding that when he moved a magnet into or out of a coil of wire, a current was induced in the wire, just as it had been when the current in a nearby coil was changed. And once again the essential feature was change, for a magnet resting motionless inside a coil produced no current, but a magnet in motion did. And this discovery, which he called magneto-electric induction, showed that electricity could indeed be generated from magnetism, provided there was relative motion between the magnet and the conductor. And this was the principle that would eventually power the modern world. Though Faraday, with his characteristic modesty, could not have foreseen the vast cities illuminated by electric light that would one day trace their lineage back to his iron ring and copper wire. In these October experiments, Faraday also explored what happened when he moved a wire through the field of a stationary magnet, and found that this too induced a current, which made sense if one considered that what mattered was the relative motion between the wire and the magnetic influence, not which one was moving in absolute terms. And he began to think about this magnetic influence in terms of invisible lines of force extending through space, lines that could be cut by a moving wire to produce an electric effect. And this way of thinking, which seemed strange to many of his contemporaries who preferred to think of forces acting at a distance without any intervening medium, would prove to be extraordinarily fruitful in the decades to come. Building upon these observations, Faraday constructed what he called a new electrical machine, which was in fact the first electric dynamo, the ancestor of all the generators that would later produce electricity for human use. And it was a remarkably simple device, consisting of a copper disc mounted so that it could rotate between the poles of a powerful horseshoe magnet, with one sliding contact touching the edge of the disc and another touching the axle at the center. And when the disc was turned by hand, a continuous current flowed between these contacts, not just a momentary pulse as in his earlier experiments, but a steady stream of electricity for as long as the disc kept spinning. And this was perhaps the first demonstration that mechanical motion could be converted directly into electrical current in a sustained and practical manner. During this period of intense investigation, Faraday also conducted experiments on electrostatic shielding, exploring what happened when a person or object was enclosed within a conducting shell and subjected to strong electrical influences. And he found that the interior of such a shell remained free of electrical effects even when the exterior was highly charged, a phenomenon that has since come to bear his name, the Faraday cage. And he tested this principle dramatically by constructing a large cube covered with conducting materials and sitting inside it while powerful electrical machines discharged sparks against the outer surface, observing that within the enclosure he felt nothing at all. No prickling of the skin, no disturbance of sensitive instruments, complete protection provided by the conducting shell that surrounded him. Faraday presented these discoveries to the scientific community through his Bakerian lectures at the Royal Society, a prestigious series of lectures that he would deliver on multiple occasions throughout his career. And he published his findings in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society as a series titled Experimental Researches in Electricity, a work that would eventually grow to encompass 30 series of papers published over more than 2 decades. And the first 3 series, appearing between 1831 and 1833, laid out the fundamental principles of electromagnetic induction with characteristic clarity and thoroughness, describing not only the experiments themselves, but also the reasoning that connected them and the broader implications that might be drawn from the results. In these published researches, Faraday formulated the laws of electromagnetic induction that bear his name, stating the conditions under which an electromotive force would be induced in a conductor, and expressing the relationship between the rate of change of magnetic influence and the strength of the induced effect, and though he did not express these laws in mathematical form, preferring always to think in terms of physical pictures and direct experimental observations, his descriptions were precise enough that later scientists, most notably James Clerk Maxwell, would be able to translate them into the elegant mathematical equations that now form the foundation of electromagnetic theory. The year 1833 brought another significant contribution, as Faraday turned his attention to the process of electrolysis, the decomposition of substances by the passage of electric current, and through careful experiments he established the laws that govern this process, showing that the amount of a substance deposited or dissolved at an electrode was proportional to the quantity of electricity passed through the solution, and furthermore that this amount depended on the chemical equivalent weight of the substance in question, relationships that pointed toward a deep connection between electricity and chemical combination, suggesting that the forces holding atoms together in compounds were themselves electrical in nature. To describe these phenomena with proper precision, Faraday found that the existing terminology was inadequate, and so he undertook to introduce a new vocabulary, working together with his friend William Whewell, a scholar at Cambridge University who had a particular talent for coining scientific terms, and between them they created a set of words that have since become indispensable in chemistry and physics, including the terms electrode for the conducting surfaces at which the electrical effects occurred, anode for the electrode toward which anions migrated, cathode for the electrode toward which cations moved, ion for the charged particles that carried electricity through the solution, and electrolyte for the substance through which they passed, a vocabulary that has remained essentially unchanged for nearly 2 centuries, and is still taught to students around the world in their first chemistry courses. But even as Faraday's scientific work reached new heights, his health began to show troubling signs of strain, and in 1831, the very year of his great discovery, he experienced episodes of giddiness and severe headaches, along with a symptom that troubled him greatly, a difficulty with memory that made him forget words and lose track of his thoughts in mid-sentence, a distressing experience for anyone but particularly painful for a man whose entire vocation depended upon clear and accurate thinking. And these symptoms would recur and worsen throughout the remainder of his life, though their ultimate cause has never been determined with certainty, some suggesting that his years of exposure to chemical fumes and substances in the laboratory had damaged his nervous system, others proposing that he suffered from some form of age-related decline that simply appeared earlier than usual. Following his physician's advice, Faraday took rest at the seaside town of Hastings, walking along the shore and allowing his mind to recover from the intense exertions of the preceding months. And this pattern of work followed by collapse followed by slow recovery would characterize much of his later career, each burst of productive research extracting a toll that required time and quiet to repay. And he learned to pace himself, though never as carefully as his friends and family wished, for the lure of investigation was strong and the questions he pursued seemed always to multiply faster than he could answer them. In 1835, the Royal Society offered Faraday its presidency, the highest honor the scientific community of Britain could bestow, and he declined, explaining that he wished to remain simply Michael Faraday, devoted to his experiments and his lectures rather than to the administrative duties and social obligations that the presidency would require. And this refusal was characteristic of his entire approach to life. His persistent rejection of honors and titles that might elevate him above his natural position as a working philosopher of nature, a man in a plain coat who came to the laboratory each morning to ask questions of the material world and to record its answers with patience and humility. And so the years from 1831 to 1834 established Faraday as one of the foremost scientists of his age, the discoverer of fundamental principles that would transform human civilization. Yet he continued to live simply, to worship each week with his Sandemanian congregation, to write letters to his friends in the same warm and unassuming tone he had always used, and to walk to his laboratory through the streets of London like any other tradesman going about his daily work, unremarkable to the passers-by who could not have known that the neat, quiet gentleman they passed had that very morning induced an electric current with a moving magnet, or traced the path of an invisible line of force, or taken one more small step toward understanding the hidden structure of the universe that lay beneath the surfaces of ordinary things, waiting patiently to be discovered by anyone with eyes to see and the willingness to look. In the years following his great discoveries of electromagnetic induction, Michael Faraday found himself turning inward, not in the sense of withdrawal from the world, but rather in the sense of contemplation, of wondering what these invisible forces truly were and how they move through the space around us. He had shown that a changing magnetic field could produce an electric current, and that the relationship between electricity and magnetism was intimate and real. But the deeper question remained, gently persistent, like a quiet companion at his workbench. How did these forces travel from one place to another? And what was the nature of the space through which they moved? These questions would occupy him through the decade that followed, leading him toward ideas that would seem strange to many of his contemporaries, but would eventually reshape the very foundations of physics. The prevailing view among natural philosophers of the time was something called action at a distance, which held that forces like gravity and magnetism simply acted instantaneously across empty space, reaching out from one body to another without any intervening medium or mechanism. A magnet attracted iron, and this attraction was thought to leap across the gap between them with no need for explanation of what happened in the space between. This idea had served well enough for Newton's gravity and for the mathematical treatments of electricity developed by continental scientists, and most were content to accept it as simply the way nature worked. But Faraday, who thought always in terms of what he could see and touch and demonstrate, found this notion unsatisfying. He could not imagine a force traveling through nothingness, through true emptiness, without leaving some trace of its passage, some evidence of its presence in the intervening space. And so he began to develop a different picture, one that emerged gradually from his experiments and from hours of quiet observation in his laboratory at the Royal Institution. When he sprinkled iron filings on a piece of paper placed over a magnet, he saw them arrange themselves into beautiful curved patterns, radiating outward from the poles and sweeping around in graceful arcs that connected one end of the magnet to the other. These patterns were not random, and they were not arbitrary, and they suggested to Faraday that something real existed in the space around the magnet, something that guided the filings into their positions and revealed itself through their arrangement. He called these patterns lines of force, and he began to think of them not merely as convenient illustrations but as representations of an actual physical reality, invisible threads of magnetic influence extending through the space around every magnet. This was a revolutionary departure from the accepted view, though Faraday himself would never have used such dramatic language. He simply followed where his experiments led him, trusting his observations and his carefully developed intuitions about the natural world. The lines of force were not mathematical abstractions to him, not mere conveniences for calculation, but something like real presences in space, channels along which magnetic influence flowed and through which electrical effects might propagate. He would spend years developing this picture, refining it, testing it against new experiments, and though many of his mathematical colleagues remained skeptical, finding his ideas difficult to translate into the precise equations they preferred, Faraday continued to build upon this foundation with patient determination. In 1836, he turned his attention to electrostatic induction, the way that an electrically charged body could influence other bodies without touching them, and he designed a series of careful experiments to investigate how this influence traveled through space. The accepted view, again rooted in action at a distance, held that electrostatic forces acted in straight lines between charged bodies, but Faraday suspected otherwise. Through painstaking measurements and ingenious experimental arrangements, he demonstrated that electrostatic induction actually occurs along curved lines, that the influence of a charged body does not simply leap across space in the shortest path but follows contoured routes that depend upon the arrangement of conductors and insulators in the surrounding environment. This was further evidence for his vision of lines of force filling space, bending and curving in response to the material conditions through which they passed. That same year, 1836, Faraday constructed what would later become known as the Faraday cage, though he himself did not use this name. He built a large cube from wire mesh, approximately 12 feet on each side, large enough for a person to enter and move about within. This wire enclosure was placed in the lecture theatre of the Royal Institution, and Faraday himself climbed inside while his assistants discharged powerful electrical apparatus outside the cage, sending sparks and electrical displays crackling through the air around him. Inside the wire cube, Faraday sat calmly, surrounded by his electroscopes and measuring instruments, observing that no electrical effect penetrated to the interior of the enclosure. The electrical influence stopped at the outer surface of the wire mesh and did not pass through to the space within. This demonstration showed that a conducting enclosure completely shields its interior from external electrostatic fields, and it provided further support for Faraday's ideas about how electrical influence spreads through space and is guided by the materials it encounters. Through these years, Faraday corresponded with various scientific colleagues about the concepts he was developing, and in 1838 he engaged in a particularly fruitful exchange with William Whewell, the philosopher and historian of science at Cambridge. Faraday was not trained in classical languages, and he found himself in need of precise terminology to describe the phenomena he was investigating, terms that would be clear and specific and free from misleading associations. Whewell, who had a gift for such things and who had already coined the word scientist itself, suggested several new terms that Faraday adopted and that remain in use today. The words electrode, anode, cathode, ion, and electrolyte all emerged from this correspondence, giving the growing science of electrochemistry a vocabulary that precisely matched the phenomena being studied. Faraday was grateful for this assistance, and the collaboration between the experimentalist who struggled with Greek and the philosopher who delighted in it proved beneficial to the progress of understanding. But the mind that worked so tirelessly, that observed so keenly and reasoned so carefully, was not immune to the strains of sustained effort and the burdens of advancing years. In 1839, when Faraday was approaching 50 years of age, he began to experience severe difficulties with his memory and his concentration. The symptoms grew worse over the following months, and by 1840 he found himself unable to work, unable even to hold a train of thought long enough to complete simple tasks. He suffered what we might now describe as a complete mental breakdown, though such terms were not used in his time, and he experienced periods of profound memory loss when he could not recall work he had done or conversations he had held. The precise cause of this collapse remains uncertain, though some historians have speculated that years of exposure to mercury and other toxic substances in his chemical researches may have contributed to his difficulties. Whatever the cause, the effect was devastating, and Faraday was forced to take an extended leave from the Royal Institution, the first such absence in his long career there. During this difficult period, his wife Sarah remained constantly at his side, providing the quiet support and gentle care that he needed. The couple had no children, and their bond with each other was the center of their domestic life, a relationship of deep mutual affection that had sustained them through decades of Faraday's demanding work. Sarah understood, as perhaps no one else could, the toll that his researches had taken upon him, and she devoted herself to his recovery with patient determination. In 1841, the two of them traveled together to Switzerland, seeking rest and recuperation among the mountains and clean air of that country. They spent several months abroad, and Faraday allowed himself to step away from science entirely, to walk the alpine paths and breathe the mountain air and let his exhausted mind slowly heal. Throughout this period of illness and recovery, Faraday's faith remained a central anchor in his life. In 1840, he had been appointed as an elder in the Sandemanian Church, a position of considerable responsibility within that small and close-knit community. The Sandemanians took their religious obligations very seriously, and attendance at services was not a matter of casual convenience but of solemn duty. Faraday served in this role for several years, though in 1844 he was temporarily suspended from his position as elder for missing a single service. The circumstances of this absence are not entirely clear, though it appears that the demands of his recovering health or perhaps an obligation at the Royal Institution had kept him away. The suspension was a painful experience for him, as his faith was deeply personal and his standing in the congregation mattered greatly to him. He was eventually restored to his position, and the incident passed, but it reminded him of the exacting standards of the community to which he had devoted his spiritual life. By 1844 and into 1845, Faraday had recovered sufficiently to return to active research, though he would never again possess quite the tireless energy of his younger years. He had learned to pace himself, to rest when rest was needed, and to accept that his memory and concentration were no longer as reliable as they once had been. He kept detailed notes of everything, writing down his thoughts and observations immediately so that he would not lose them, and he developed systems to compensate for his difficulties. And it was in this period of careful, measured return to work that he made discoveries which would prove among the most significant of his entire career. On the 13th of September, 1845, Faraday observed something that no one had ever seen before, a phenomenon that revealed a connection between magnetism and light that had not been suspected. He had been working with a piece of heavy glass, a dense optical glass that he himself had helped to develop years earlier during his work on improving glass for lighthouses. He set up an apparatus in which a beam of polarized light whose waves vibrate in a single plane, passed through this piece of heavy glass while powerful electromagnets generated a magnetic field along the path of the light. When the magnets were activated, Faraday observed that the plane of polarization rotated, that the light emerging from the glass was polarized at a different angle than the light entering it. This rotation occurred only when the magnetic field was present, and it reversed direction when the magnetic field was reversed. This discovery, which came to be called the Faraday effect, was the first experimental evidence that magnetism could affect light, that these two phenomena which seemed so different were in fact connected at some deep level. Light was not merely a mechanical vibration independent of electromagnetic influences, but was somehow bound up with the same forces that attracted iron to magnets and that produced electric currents in moving wires. Faraday understood immediately the significance of what he had found, and he recorded in his laboratory notebook that he had at last succeeded in magnetizing and electrifying a ray of light. This connection between light and magnetism would later prove essential to James Clerk Maxwell's unified theory of electromagnetism, which would show that light itself is an electromagnetic wave traveling through the lines of force that Faraday had spent so many years contemplating. Just weeks after this discovery, still in September of 1845, Faraday made another observation of great importance. He found that when he suspended various substances in the magnetic field of his powerful electromagnets, they responded in ways he had not expected. While iron and a few other materials were attracted strongly toward the poles of the magnet, as everyone knew, other substances were actually weakly repelled. He observed that bismuth, heavy glass, and many other materials moved away from the magnetic poles rather than toward them, positioning themselves across the lines of force rather than along them. He called this property diamagnetism, to distinguish it from the ordinary magnetism of iron, and through further experiments he demonstrated that all matter responds to magnetic fields in one way or another. Some materials are paramagnetic, weakly attracted to magnets, while others are diamagnetic, weakly repelled, but no substance is entirely indifferent to the presence of a magnetic field. This discovery extended the reach of magnetic influence to the entire material world, suggesting that the lines of magnetic force which Faraday had envisioned did not merely exist in the space around magnets, but interacted with all matter through which they passed. His concept of magnetic lines of force extending through space, bending around obstacles and filling the regions between magnets and the objects they influenced, became richer and more compelling with each new observation. In the year 1825, Michael Faraday proposed something rather lovely to the managers of the Royal Institution, a simple idea that would carry forward through the centuries and continue still to this very day. He suggested that during the Christmas season, when the city grew quiet and families gathered together, there ought to be a series of lectures designed specifically for young people, for children who might otherwise never encounter the wonders of the natural world explained with patience and care. The managers agreed, and so in 1826 the first of the Christmas lectures took place, beginning a tradition that has continued almost without interruption for nearly 200 years, a gentle gift from Faraday to generations of young minds he would never meet. Faraday himself would go on to deliver 19 separate series of these Christmas lectures over the course of his career, standing before audiences of young people and their families in the lecture theatre of the Royal Institution, speaking of chemistry and physics and the hidden forces that shape our world. He spoke of metals, of electricity, of the atmosphere we breathe, of the forces that hold matter together and the forces that pull it apart. Each series consisted of several lectures delivered across the Christmas holiday period, and each one represented Faraday's deep conviction that science belonged not only to specialists and scholars but to everyone, including the very young, including those who had never held a scientific instrument in their hands. The most famous of all these lectures, the series that would eventually become his most celebrated written work, was titled The Chemical History of a Candle. He first delivered this series in 1848, explaining through the simple and familiar object of a burning candle all the fundamental principles of chemistry and combustion, of oxygen and hydrogen, of the nature of flame itself. A candle, he showed his young audience, was not merely a source of light but a miniature chemical laboratory, a site where extraordinary transformations occurred continuously and silently. He spoke of the wax melting and rising through the wick by capillary action, of the vaporization that occurred at the tip of the wick, of the combustion that produced heat and light and invisible products that dispersed into the surrounding air. So beloved was this series that Faraday delivered it again in 1860 and 1861, near the very end of his lecturing career, and it was from these later deliveries that the lectures were transcribed and eventually published as a book. The Chemical History of a Candle became his most widely read work, translated into many languages and reprinted countless times, introducing generation after generation to the pleasures of scientific thinking through the contemplation of something as humble and domestic as a candle burning on a table. There is something deeply characteristic of Faraday in this choice of subject, this insistence that profound truths could be found in ordinary things, that one need not travel to distant lands or acquire expensive equipment to encounter the marvels of nature. Beyond the Christmas lectures, Faraday became renowned for another institution he helped establish at the Royal Institution, the Friday Evening Discourses. These were lectures delivered on Friday evenings throughout the year, attended by members of the institution and their guests, and they became celebrated occasions in the intellectual and social life of London. The format was precise, each lecture lasting exactly 1 hour, beginning at precisely 9 o'clock and ending at precisely 10, with no allowance for running over time. Faraday himself delivered well over 100 of these discourses on subjects ranging across the whole of natural philosophy, and he transformed them into something approaching an art form, setting standards for public scientific communication that influenced lecturers for generations afterward. His philosophy of lecturing was grounded in careful preparation and apparent ease. He believed that a lecturer should appear easy and collected, undaunted and unconcerned, however anxious he might feel within himself. The audience should never sense struggle or uncertainty, never feel that the lecturer was groping for words or unsure of the next demonstration. Everything should flow as naturally as conversation, yet with a clarity and precision that conversation rarely achieves. Faraday rehearsed extensively, practiced his demonstrations until they worked flawlessly, and paid close attention to matters that lesser lecturers might have ignored: the lighting in the room, the visibility of apparatus from every seat, the volume and pace of speech, the strategic use of pauses to allow ideas to settle into the minds of listeners. He advised that diagrams should be large and simple, that demonstrations should be chosen not for their spectacular effect, but for their ability to illuminate the point at hand, that the lecturer should speak to the back of the room while maintaining a sense of intimacy with every listener. He warned against the temptation to include too much material, preferring a few ideas thoroughly developed to many ideas superficially sketched. He was opposed to the reading of lectures from written text, believing that this created a barrier between speaker and audience, and he spoke instead from carefully memorized outlines, allowing himself flexibility while maintaining structure. All of this attention to craft emerged from his conviction that science deserved the finest possible presentation, that the communication of knowledge was itself a noble endeavor worthy of the same dedication one might bring to original research. While Faraday was establishing these new standards for public science, he was also being drawn into various forms of government service, lending his expertise to practical problems facing the nation. In 1836, he was appointed scientific advisor to Trinity House, the organization responsible for lighthouses, buoys, and other aids to navigation around the coasts of Britain. This position he would hold for over 30 years, and he took it very seriously indeed, visiting lighthouses, investigating problems, and working to improve the illumination upon which the safety of sailors depended. The challenges were considerable, for lighthouses of that era relied on oil lamps and various arrangements of reflectors and lenses to project their light across the waters. Faraday worked on improving ventilation systems to ensure that the lamps burned cleanly and brightly, and he investigated new designs for reflectors that would gather and direct the light more efficiently. He corresponded with lighthouse keepers, visited remote coastal stations, and concerned himself with details that might seem mundane but which made real differences to the performance of these vital installations. As technology advanced, Faraday explored the possibility of using electric light in lighthouses, recognizing that the intense brightness of the electric arc lamp might serve navigation far better than any oil flame. In 1858, he supervised experiments at the South Foreland Lighthouse on the Kent coast, where electric lights were tested under operational conditions. The work was pioneering but also problematic, for the technology was not yet reliable enough for permanent installation, and the generators required to produce the electricity were temperamental and expensive to operate. Nevertheless, these experiments pointed the way toward the future, and the eventual adoption of electric illumination in lighthouses owed something to Faraday's early investigations and his willingness to explore what was then the cutting edge of lighting technology. His government service extended into many other areas as well. As early as 1831, he served as an advisor to the Admiralty on the problem of ship corrosion, investigating how the copper sheathing used to protect wooden hulls from marine organisms interacted with the iron fastenings and other metals used in ship construction. This was essentially an electrochemical problem, involving the same principles that Faraday would later explore in his fundamental research on electrolysis, and his advice helped the Navy understand and address the accelerated corrosion that occurred when dissimilar metals were in contact in seawater. He was consulted on matters relating to the conservation of paintings at the National Gallery, where the effects of London's smoky atmosphere on the surfaces of artworks were causing concern. He offered advice to the British Museum on similar matters. He sat on government committees investigating everything from the lighting of public buildings to the preservation of ancient stonework. In each case, he brought the same careful attention to evidence and the same patient analysis of causes and effects that characterized his laboratory research. One particularly somber instance of his public service came in 1844, when a terrible explosion at the Haswell Colliery in County Durham killed 95 miners. Faraday was asked to investigate, and together with the geologist Charles Lyell, he descended into the mine, examined the workings, and produced a report that attributed the disaster to the ignition of fire damp, the dangerous mixture of methane and air that accumulates in coal mines. The report recommended improvements to ventilation systems that would reduce the risk of future explosions, and while such tragedies would continue to occur throughout the 19th century, the scientific investigation of their causes helped gradually to improve the safety of this dangerous industry. In 1846, Faraday delivered one of his Friday evening discourses under the title Thoughts on Ray Vibrations, and in this lecture he allowed himself to speculate more freely than was his usual habit. He suggested that light might be understood as a form of vibration in the lines of magnetic and electric force that pervaded space, that rather than requiring a separate medium called the luminiferous ether, light might propagate through the very same field of force that manifested in electromagnetic phenomena. This was a bold speculation, offered tentatively and without mathematical development, and Faraday himself was uncertain whether it should be taken seriously or regarded merely as an imaginative exercise. But the idea would prove prophetic. 2 decades later, the Scottish physicist James Clerk Maxwell would develop his mathematical theory of electromagnetism, and in doing so he would demonstrate that electromagnetic disturbances propagated through space at precisely the speed of light, leading to the conclusion that light was itself an electromagnetic wave. Maxwell freely acknowledged his debt to Faraday, Recognizing that the concept of lines of force and the intuition that light and electromagnetism might be unified had originated in that lecture theatre at the Royal Institution. What Faraday had glimpsed through physical intuition, Maxwell confirmed through mathematical analysis, and together their work laid the foundation for our modern understanding of electromagnetic radiation. As Faraday's fame grew and his contributions to science became undeniable, honors were offered to him that he steadily refused. He declined a knighthood not once but twice, feeling that such titles were unsuited to a man of science who valued truth above social distinction. He also declined the presidency of the Royal Society, that most prestigious position in British science, preferring to remain simply a working researcher and lecturer at the Royal Institution where he had spent his entire career. There was no false modesty in these refusals, merely a quiet sense that his identity was bound up with his work rather than with titles or positions, and that the accumulation of honors would distract from rather than contribute to his purposes. In 1853, Faraday turned his attention to a popular craze that was sweeping through the parlors of Britain, the phenomenon of table turning. In senses and spiritualist gatherings, participants would sit around a table with their hands resting lightly upon its surface, and after some time the table would begin to move, apparently of its own accord, rotating or shifting across the floor in ways that believers attributed to the influence of spirits or some unknown psychic force. Faraday was skeptical, and being Faraday, he designed experiments to investigate the matter. He constructed apparatus that would reveal whether the movement originated from the table itself or from the hands of the participants, using cardboard indicators and other devices that would show the direction and source of any pressure applied. His experiments demonstrated clearly that the participants themselves were pushing the table, not deliberately or consciously in most cases, but through tiny involuntary movements of which they were unaware. When his apparatus made it impossible for participants to push without knowing they were pushing, the table turning ceased. The phenomenon, he concluded, was the result of unconscious muscular action rather than any supernatural agency. He published his findings, debunking the claims of spiritualists with the same careful experimental method he applied to all other questions, and while believers remained unconvinced, the scientific explanation was established clearly for those willing to accept evidence over wishful thinking. Throughout all of this, throughout the lectures and the government service and the public demonstrations and the debunking of frauds, Faraday remained the same quiet, methodical, deeply religious man he had always been. He rose early, worked steadily, attended to his correspondence with care, and returned each Sunday to the small Sandemanian meeting house where he had worshipped since his youth. The fame never changed him, the honors refused never embittered him, and the demands upon his time never caused him to abandon the fundamental rhythms of his life. He continued to believe that the natural world was a manifestation of divine order, that to study nature was to glimpse the mind of its creator, and that the communication of scientific knowledge was a form of service to humanity. And so the years passed gently by, the lectures continuing, the service continuing, the quiet steady work of a life devoted entirely to understanding and to teaching. In the decades spanning 1850 to 1858, Michael Faraday entered what would become the final sustained period of his scientific work, a time marked by ambitious theoretical speculations, persistent experimental endeavors, and the gradual but unmistakable dimming of the remarkable mental faculties that had served him so well throughout his long career. These years saw him reaching toward ever more fundamental questions about the nature of physical reality, seeking connections between forces that appeared separate, while simultaneously attending to practical matters of public health and coastal safety with the same methodical care he brought to his laboratory investigations. The question of gravity had occupied Faraday's thoughts intermittently for many years, representing in his mind the final great unification that might bring all physical forces under a single explanatory framework. He had demonstrated the connections between electricity and magnetism, had shown how magnetism could influence light, and had revealed the magnetic responsiveness of all matter through his work on diamagnetism. Gravity alone seemed to stand apart, operating through mechanisms that appeared entirely distinct from the electromagnetic phenomena he had spent his life investigating. Beginning in 1849 and continuing through much of the following decade, Faraday undertook a series of experiments designed to detect any relationship between gravitational and electromagnetic effects, experiments that consumed considerable time and energy despite yielding no positive results whatsoever. His approach to these investigations was characteristically direct and practical. He reasoned that if gravity were related to electricity or magnetism, then objects falling under gravitational influence might generate detectable electrical currents, or the gravitational force itself might be altered by strong magnetic fields. To test the first proposition, Faraday constructed coils of copper wire and dropped them from considerable heights, carefully measuring any electrical signals that might arise from their descent. He dropped these coils from the shot tower near Waterloo Bridge, watching them fall through the London air while sensitive galvanometers waited below to register the faintest electrical whisper. The instruments remained silent, detecting nothing beyond the baseline fluctuations that accompanied all such measurements. Not content with these initial attempts, Faraday expanded his investigations to the Greenwich Observatory, where he could conduct experiments under more controlled conditions and with access to precision instruments designed for astronomical observations. He suspended masses from long wires and set them swinging like pendulums, searching for any electromagnetic effects that might accompany their gravitational oscillations. He varied the materials of the masses, tried different configurations of detecting coils, and repeated the experiments at different times of day to account for any environmental factors. Each experiment confirmed the same negative result, yet Faraday persisted, convinced that the connection must exist even if his methods were insufficiently sensitive to detect it. His experiments at Waterloo Bridge involved a different approach entirely, using the height available from that structure to allow falling objects more time to develop any electromagnetic signature that might arise from gravitational acceleration. The precise arrangements and repetitions of these trials occupied him for extended periods, each failure prompting not discouragement but rather a refinement of technique or a modification of hypothesis. Faraday documented these unsuccessful experiments with the same meticulous care he applied to his discoveries, recognizing that negative results, properly recorded and analyzed, contributed to scientific knowledge just as surely as positive findings. Throughout these years of searching for gravitational connections, Faraday continued to develop the theoretical framework that would become his most enduring contribution to physics. In 1852, he published a paper titled On the Physical Character of the Lines of Magnetic Force, a work that articulated more formally and completely the field concept he had been developing for nearly 3 decades. In this paper, Faraday distinguished carefully between what he termed physical lines of force, which represented real conditions in space capable of producing physical effects, and merely mathematical lines of force, which served as convenient representations without necessarily corresponding to actual physical states. This distinction was crucial to his understanding of electromagnetic phenomena and represented a significant departure from the prevailing view that forces acted instantaneously across empty space. The paper of 1852 laid out a vision of physical reality in which space itself was filled with conditions of strain and stress, conditions represented by the lines of force that Faraday had been mapping throughout his experimental career. These lines were not imaginary constructs but physical entities that took time to establish themselves and could transmit influences from one point to another through their continuous connections. Faraday argued that the phenomena of electromagnetic induction, which he had discovered 2 decades earlier, could only be properly understood if the lines of force were granted genuine physical status, as the cutting of lines by conductors produced effects that implied real physical interactions rather than mere mathematical relationships. His work on diamagnetism and paramagnetism continued throughout this period, gradually establishing a comprehensive classification of all matter according to its magnetic response. Faraday recognized that substances could be arranged along a continuous spectrum from strongly paramagnetic materials, which align themselves parallel to magnetic fields, through weakly responding materials, to diamagnetic substances, which oriented themselves perpendicular to the field direction. This classification applied to every material he tested without exception, confirming his conviction that magnetism represented a universal property of matter rather than a peculiarity of iron and its allies. In 1855, Faraday returned to investigations of the effect of magnetic fields on light, extending the research that had led to his discovery of the magneto-optic effect a decade earlier. These experiments examined the polarization of light passing through various transparent substances placed in strong magnetic fields, seeking to understand more fully the relationship between electromagnetic forces and the nature of light itself. The work was painstaking, requiring careful attention to optical alignment and magnetic field uniformity, and Faraday approached it with characteristic thoroughness despite the increasing difficulty he experienced in maintaining concentration during lengthy experimental sessions. These investigations on light and magnetism reinforced his conviction that all physical phenomena were interconnected through the medium of the lines of force. That light itself might be understood as some form of vibration or disturbance propagated through the electromagnetic field that filled all space. Though he lacked the mathematical tools to develop this idea into a complete theory, his physical intuition pointed clearly toward the unification that would later be achieved by others building upon his conceptual foundations. In 1857, Faraday began a correspondence with James Clerk Maxwell, a young Scottish physicist who had been deeply impressed by Faraday's papers on lines of force and who possessed precisely the mathematical capabilities that Faraday himself lacked. Maxwell had published his first paper on Faraday's lines of force in 1855 and 1856, translating the older man's physical concepts into the language of differential equations and demonstrating that these ideas could be given rigorous mathematical form without losing their physical content. The exchange of letters between the two men, though modest in volume, marked the beginning of a transmission of ideas that would ultimately transform physics. Faraday welcomed Maxwell's mathematical work with genuine enthusiasm, recognizing in it a validation of his intuitive approach even as he confessed his inability to follow the detailed calculations. He encouraged Maxwell to pursue the mathematical development of field theory, while cautioning against allowing the mathematics to obscure the underlying physical realities that the equations were meant to represent. Maxwell, for his part, expressed deep respect for Faraday's experimental work and physical insight, acknowledging repeatedly that his own mathematical formulations merely gave precise expression to concepts that Faraday had grasped through direct engagement with natural phenomena. Alongside his purely scientific work, Faraday maintained throughout this period an active concern with matters of public welfare, particularly those relating to environmental conditions in London. In July of 1855, He wrote a letter to the Times newspaper describing observations he had made while travelling by boat along the River Thames. The condition of the river had disturbed him greatly, its waters so thick with sewage and refuse that objects lowered only a few inches below the surface disappeared completely from view. Faraday had tested the opacity by dropping pieces of white card into the water, watching them vanish immediately despite the bright summer sunlight. His letter described the river's state in measured but unmistakable terms, noting the offensive smell that pervaded the entire journey and the obvious health hazard posed by such contamination in the heart of the world's largest city. He called upon those in authority to address the situation before it resulted in catastrophic disease, a warning that proved prescient when cholera epidemics continued to sweep through London's poorer neighbourhoods. The letter attracted considerable attention but produced little immediate action, as the scale of the problem exceeded the willingness of Parliament to commit the necessary resources. 3 years later, during the summer of 1858, the situation reached a crisis that became known as the Great Stink, when unusually hot weather combined with the accumulated pollution to render the Thames and much of central London nearly unbearable. Parliament itself, meeting in the buildings adjacent to the river, found its proceedings disrupted by the overwhelming smell, and sheets soaked in chloride of lime were hung at the windows in a futile attempt to filter the air. Faraday was among those who testified to various parliamentary committees on the crisis, bringing his scientific authority to bear on questions of water quality and public health. His work for Trinity House continued throughout these years, providing one of the few consistent demands on his time and energy as his health fluctuated. The development of electric lighting for lighthouses remained a particular interest, with Faraday involved in experiments testing various arrangements of arc lamps and reflectors for maritime applications. The challenges were considerable, including the need for reliable operation in exposed coastal locations, the provision of adequate electrical power, and the maintenance of consistent light intensity through long nights of continuous operation. Faraday supervised trials at the Southforeland Lighthouse and contributed his expertise to decisions about which stations might benefit from electrical illumination. As the decade progressed, Faraday's mental faculties showed increasing signs of decline, a development he noted with characteristic honesty in his correspondence and diary entries. His memory, once remarkably retentive for experimental details and theoretical connections, began failing him with distressing frequency. He found himself forgetting conversations shortly after they occurred, losing track of experimental sequences he had performed many times before, and requiring written notes to deliver lectures on subjects he had mastered decades earlier. The experience was profoundly disorienting for a man who had relied throughout his career on the ability to hold complex relationships in mind while conducting intricate experimental procedures. In 1857, Faraday delivered what would prove to be his final Bakerian lecture to the Royal Society, a presentation on the optical properties of gold in its finely divided state. The research that underlay this lecture represented some of his most delicate experimental work, involving the preparation of gold films so thin as to be transparent and gold particles so small as to affect the color of transmitted light. He had discovered that gold reduced to extremely fine particles produced ruby-colored solutions or films, with the precise color depending upon the size and arrangement of the particles. This work on what would later be recognized as colloidal gold and nanoscale particles anticipated by many decades the development of nanotechnology and the scientific understanding of how particle size affects material properties. Faraday prepared his samples through careful chemical reduction of gold salts, producing solutions containing particles far too small to be seen by any microscope, then available yet clearly present from their dramatic effects on light. He documented the conditions necessary for producing particles of different sizes and noted the surprising stability of some preparations, which retained their color unchanged for months or years. The lecture itself demonstrated the properties he had discovered, displaying samples that glowed with rich colors when illuminated, colors arising not from any dissolved substance but from the interaction of light with particles almost inconceivably small. It was a fitting conclusion to his formal contributions to the Royal Society, combining careful experimental observation with theoretical speculation about the nature of matter at scales far below the visible realm. In the year 1858, when Michael Faraday had reached his 6th or 7th year and his health had declined to such a degree that even the simplest scientific investigations had become burdensome to him, Queen Victoria extended a kindness that would bring considerable comfort to his remaining days. Through the intervention of Prince Albert, who held the elderly philosopher in great esteem and understood both his contributions to the nation and his modest financial circumstances, the Queen offered Faraday the use of a house at Hampton Court Green, one of those grace and favour residences that the Crown reserves for those who have rendered distinguished service to the country. The house, number 37 on the Green, was a pleasant brick dwelling with gardens and the sort of quiet surroundings that suited a man whose nerves had become so sensitive to noise and excitement that even the rumble of carriages on city streets caused him distress. The offer came with no rent to pay, a consideration of no small importance given that Faraday had never accumulated wealth despite his fame, having throughout his life declined the lucrative consulting work that might have made him rich, preferring always to devote his energies to pure research rather than commercial application. Faraday accepted this gift with the same gracious humility that had characterized his acceptance of every honor, and he and Sarah made the move from their rooms at the Royal Institution, where they had lived for so many years, to this gentler setting beside the Thames. The house had been renovated at the Queen's expense to make it comfortable for its new occupants, and Faraday found in its quiet rooms and modest garden a refuge from the demands that his reputation still placed upon him. He could walk among the flower beds when his strength permitted, tending to the plants with the same careful attention he had once given to his apparatus, and he could sit by the windows looking out upon the green where children sometimes played and the seasons turned in their unhurried way. Yet even as his powers waned, Faraday felt one remaining obligation to the Royal Institution that had been his home for nearly half a century, and this was the continuation of the Christmas lectures for young people that he had inaugurated so many years before. In the winter of 1860 to 1861, he undertook what would prove to be his final series of these beloved talks, choosing as his subject the chemical history of a candle. It was a topic of deceptive simplicity, for in the burning of a common candle Faraday found reflected all the great principles of chemistry and physics that he had spent his life investigating. He spoke of combustion and oxidation, of the nature of the atmosphere and the properties of carbon and hydrogen, of the circulation of matter through the natural world, all illustrated by means of that humble object that had illuminated his first readings in philosophy when he was a bookbinder's apprentice. But these final lectures cost him greatly, for his memory had become so unreliable that he could no longer trust himself to speak extemporaneously as he had done in his prime. He prepared extensive notes, far more detailed than he had ever required before, and he carried these to the lectern with him, referring to them frequently in a way that would have been unnecessary in earlier years. There were moments when he lost the thread of his argument and had to pause, consulting his papers with a patience that his audience, composed largely of young people and their families, did not find awkward but rather touching. The children did not know that they were witnessing the final performances of one of the greatest scientific lecturers who had ever lived, but their parents understood, and there was in the hall a tenderness toward the white-haired gentleman who still spoke with such evident love of the natural world and its phenomena. The lectures on the candle were published and would become, in time, one of the most beloved works of popular science ever written, translated into many languages and read by generations of young people discovering for the first time the wonders that careful observation can reveal in the most ordinary objects. But their delivery had exhausted Faraday, and he knew that he could not continue. In 1862, he formally resigned from all his duties at the Royal Institution, relinquishing the professorship he had held for so many years and withdrawing from the active life of science that had defined his existence since his youth. In that same year, he also resigned from his position as an elder in the Sandemanian congregation, a decision that caused him perhaps even greater sorrow than his retirement from science. His memory had become so impaired that he could not reliably fulfill the duties of the eldership, which required the careful attention to the spiritual welfare of the congregation and the conduct of worship services. The Sandemanians had sustained him throughout his life, providing the community of faith and the framework of belief within which all his scientific work had taken its meaning. And to step back from active service in the congregation was to acknowledge a diminishment that touched the very core of his being. Yet he did so with the same acceptance of necessity that had always guided him, continuing to attend services when his health permitted, sitting quietly among his brethren as one whose work in this life was drawing toward its close. Before his retirement became complete, Faraday delivered one final lecture at the Royal Institution in the spring of 1862, and he chose for his subject not a scientific topic but rather a reflection on what he called the education of the judgment. It was a meditation on the habits of mind that had served him throughout his career, the careful weighing of evidence, the suspension of conclusion until facts had been thoroughly established, the humility before nature that he considered essential to genuine understanding. He spoke of the dangers of hasty generalization and the seductions of pet theories, of the importance of recognizing the limits of one's own knowledge, and the equal importance of remaining open to new evidence that might overturn cherished beliefs. It was, in its way, a summation of the philosophical principles that had guided his work, offered as a gift to those who would continue the pursuit of natural knowledge after he was gone. Throughout these final years, honors continued to arrive from nations across Europe and beyond, recognitions of a career that had transformed the understanding of electricity and magnetism and laid the foundations for technologies that would reshape the world. The King of Prussia conferred upon him the Order of Merit, that distinction reserved for those who have rendered extraordinary service to culture and science. France, the nation whose scientists he had so long corresponded with and whose language he had taught himself to read in order to engage with their work, awarded him the Legion of Honor. Other medals and memberships accumulated, from scientific societies in countries he had never visited, from academies that counted him among their most illustrious foreign associates. Faraday received these honors with gratitude but without ostentation, storing the medals and certificates away rather than displaying them prominently. His lifestyle remained as simple as it had ever been, his wants few, his pleasures modest. He had no interest in the trappings of fame, and the idea of accumulating wealth or living grandly would have struck him as inconsistent with both his scientific principles and his religious faith. The Sandemanians believed in simplicity and equality among believers, and Faraday had internalized these values so thoroughly that they had become indistinguishable from his own character. At Hampton Court, his days assumed a gentle rhythm suited to his declining powers. He would rise in the morning and, when his strength permitted, walk in the garden, sometimes with Sarah at his side, observing the birds and the flowers with an attention that retained something of its old scientific keenness even as his ability to pursue sustained investigation had faded. He read Scripture daily, finding comfort in the familiar words of the Bible that had been his guide since childhood, and he sat often in quiet contemplation, his mind drifting in ways that he himself found difficult to describe. There were good days when his thoughts seemed clearer and he could engage with visitors in something approaching his old manner, and there were other days when confusion descended and he sat in long silences, unable to recall what had been said moments before. Sarah remained his constant companion and caretaker throughout these years, managing the household and protecting him from demands that might overtax his fragile health. They still took carriage rides together when the weather was fine, moving slowly through the countryside surrounding Hampton Court, and these excursions brought Faraday a simple pleasure that required nothing of his failing memory. The present moment was enough, the sight of trees and fields, the presence of his wife beside him, the gentle motion of the carriage along familiar roads. Visitors still came, though Sarah carefully limited their number and the duration of their stays. John Tyndall, who had been appointed to succeed Faraday at the Royal Institution and who would eventually write the first major biography of his mentor, corresponded regularly and visited when he could, discussing scientific matters in ways that engaged whatever clarity Faraday could summon on a given day. Faraday's letters from this period show the effects of his declining memory, sometimes repeating points he had made in previous correspondence, sometimes struggling to maintain the thread of an argument, but they also show his enduring interest in the progress of science and his affection for those who were carrying the work forward. In 1860, a young Scottish physicist named James Clerk Maxwell visited Faraday at Hampton Court. Maxwell had been working on the mathematical formalization of Faraday's ideas about electromagnetic fields, developing the equations that would eventually unite electricity, magnetism, and light into a single theoretical framework. The meeting between the aging experimentalist and the young theoretician was a passing of a kind of torch, though neither could have known fully what Maxwell's work would ultimately accomplish. Faraday, who had never been comfortable with advanced mathematics, listened as Maxwell explained his approach, and while the details surely escape him, he understood that his intuitions about lines of force were being given the precise mathematical expression he himself had never been able to provide. It was a quiet meeting, two men talking of physics in a sunlit room, but it represented a continuity in the progress of understanding that would have pleased Faraday deeply. Other scientists and admirers continued to seek him out, drawn by the desire to meet the man whose discoveries had become legendary, and Faraday received them when he could, though increasingly these visits were brief and his contributions to conversation limited. His long-term memory remained relatively intact even as his ability to retain new information deteriorated, and he could speak of experiments from decades past with a clarity that contrasted strangely with his inability to recall what he had eaten for breakfast. This pattern, familiar now to those who study the aging brain but less understood in Faraday's time, meant that he could still engage with the history of his own discoveries even as the daily world slipped away from him. The question of his eventual burial had been raised by well-meaning friends and admirers, who suggested that Westminster Abbey would be the appropriate resting place for one who had contributed so greatly to British science and whose fame had spread throughout the world. A place beside Newton seemed fitting to those who measured Faraday's achievements against the history of natural philosophy. But Faraday, true to his Sandemanian faith, declined this honor. The Sandemanians believed in simple burial among their own community, without the elaborate monuments or prestigious locations that the world valued. Faraday had lived his entire life in accordance with these principles, and he would not abandon them in death. He asked instead to be buried in the Sandemanian section of Highgate Cemetery, in the same manner as any other member of the congregation, his grave marked by a simple headstone rather than an elaborate memorial. And so the days passed at Hampton Court Green, one following another in the unhurried succession that marks the closing chapter of a long life. The garden bloomed and faded with the seasons. The light changed through the windows as the year turned, and Michael Faraday, who had done so much to illuminate the hidden workings of nature, sat quietly in his chair or walked slowly among his flowers, attended by his faithful Sarah and visited occasionally by those who remembered what he had been and honored what he had given to the world. His mind wandered through landscapes of memory, touching now upon the bindery where he had first learned to love books, now upon the basement laboratory where he had made his great discoveries, now upon nothing in particular, simply resting in the fading light of his long afternoon. The great work was done, the contributions made and recorded, and what remained was simply the living out of days in peace, waiting with the patience of faith for whatever might come next. On the 25th day of August, in the year 1867, Michael Faraday passed quietly from this world while sitting in his chair at Hampton Court, where Queen Victoria had granted him grace and favour residence some years before in recognition of his immense contributions to science and to the nation. He was 75 years of age, and his passing came not with struggle or distress, but with the gentle quietude that had characterized so much of his personal manner throughout his long and remarkable life. The man who had done more than perhaps any other to illuminate the invisible forces that bind the universe together simply closed his eyes and was still, his work complete, his questions asked and answered to the fullest extent that one human life might allow, his faith in both natural philosophy and divine providence unshaken to the very last. Those who attended him in his final years had observed the gradual dimming of that once brilliant mind, the slow retreat of memory and concentration that had troubled him increasingly since the demanding researches of his middle decades. And yet even in this diminished state there remained about Faraday a certain peace, a settledness of spirit that spoke to the deep harmony he had achieved between his scientific understanding and his religious convictions. He had not feared death, viewing it as he did through the lens of his Sandemanian faith, which taught that the faithful would rest until the resurrection, and that earthly honors and monuments were of little consequence compared to the simple act of living according to one's beliefs and serving one's community with humility and dedication. 5 days after his death, on the 30th of August, 1867, Michael Faraday was buried at Highgate Cemetery in London, in the section reserved for dissenters, those Christians who stood apart from the established Church of England and followed their own paths of worship and understanding. This choice of resting place was entirely in keeping with his lifelong membership in the Sandemanian Church, that small and quiet congregation which had shaped his moral character and provided him with spiritual sustenance through all the challenges and triumphs of his career. The ceremony itself was simple in the extreme, attended by family members and close friends, with none of the grand processional pomp that might have accompanied the funeral of a man so celebrated and so universally admired. His grave was marked not with an elaborate monument or towering memorial, but with a flat stone of modest dimensions, bearing only his name and the essential dates of his existence, precisely as he had wished and as the practices of his faith prescribed. There was no attempt to enumerate his discoveries or catalogue his honours, no lengthy epitaph proclaiming his genius to future generations, just the quiet acknowledgement that here lay a man named Michael Faraday, who had lived and died and was now at rest. Sarah, his beloved wife of nearly 50 years, survived him by more than a decade, passing away in 1879. And when her time came she was laid to rest beside him in that same peaceful corner of Highgate, The two of them reunited in death as they had been inseparable in life, sharing the same modest patch of earth beneath the same gentle English sky. The estate that Faraday left behind amounted to approximately £6,000, a sum that, while comfortable, was remarkably modest for a man who could have amassed a considerable fortune had he chosen to pursue the many lucrative opportunities presented to him throughout his career. He had declined consulting fees from industrial concerns that would have paid handsomely for his expertise, turned away from patent rights that might have made him wealthy beyond measure, and refused professorships and positions that carried substantial salaries but would have diverted him from his research at the Royal Institution. This was not negligence or unworldliness in any naive sense, but rather a deliberate choice to prioritize the pursuit of knowledge over the accumulation of wealth, to remain free from commercial entanglements that might compromise his scientific independence or consume the time he wished to devote to pure investigation. Even in death, Faraday's influence continued to grow and deepen, carried forward by those who had learned from his methods and built upon his insights. Perhaps the most significant development in the years immediately following his passing came from the pen of James Clerk Maxwell, the brilliant Scottish physicist who had long recognized the profound implications of Faraday's experimental work and conceptual innovations. In 1873, just 6 years after Faraday's death, Maxwell published his monumental work entitled A Treatise on Electricity and Magnetism, a comprehensive mathematical treatment that took Faraday's intuitive understanding of fields and lines of force and translated them into the precise language of differential equations and vector calculus. What Maxwell accomplished in this treatise was nothing less than the complete unification of electricity and magnetism into a single coherent framework, demonstrating through rigorous mathematics what Faraday had grasped through physical intuition and careful experiment. The equations that Maxwell derived, known today as Maxwell's equations, showed that changing electric fields produce magnetic fields, and changing magnetic fields produce electric fields, and that these interlinked disturbances could propagate through space as waves traveling at a speed that, when calculated from known electrical and magnetic constants, turned out to be precisely the speed of light. This was a revelation of the most profound significance, for it suggested that light itself was an electromagnetic phenomenon, a conclusion that Faraday had suspected decades earlier when he discovered the rotation of polarized light by magnetic fields in his magneto-optical experiments. Maxwell's mathematical formalization of Faraday's field theory did more than merely confirm existing results, for it predicted the existence of electromagnetic waves at frequencies beyond those of visible light, predictions that would be experimentally verified by Heinrich Hertz in the 1880s and would eventually lead to the development of radio, television, radar, and all the wireless technologies that have transformed modern life. In this sense, the practical consequences of Faraday's conceptual revolution, channeled through Maxwell's mathematical genius, continue to shape our world in ways that neither man could have fully anticipated, though both sensed that they were uncovering truths of universal significance and lasting importance. The recognition of Faraday's foundational role in our understanding of electromagnetism only deepened as the decades passed and new generations of physicists built upon his work. Perhaps no acknowledgement carried more weight than that of Albert Einstein, who kept in his study a portrait of Faraday alongside portraits of Isaac Newton and James Clerk Maxwell, the three figures whom Einstein regarded as the supreme architects of physical understanding. Einstein understood, perhaps better than anyone of his generation, that Faraday's introduction of the field concept represented a conceptual revolution of the first magnitude, a shift away from the mechanical philosophy of action at a distance toward a vision of space itself as the medium of physical interaction and the repository of energy and physical reality. This recognition was not merely sentimental or historical, for Einstein's own work on relativity drew directly upon the field-theoretic framework that Faraday had initiated and Maxwell had formalized. The special theory of relativity, published in 1905, arose in part from Einstein's contemplation of how electromagnetic fields transform between different reference frames, while the general theory of relativity, completed a decade later, represented spacetime itself as a dynamic field whose curvature constitutes what we experience as gravitation. In tracing the lineage of these revolutionary ideas, Einstein saw clearly that the conceptual ground had been prepared by Faraday's insistence that the space surrounding magnets and electric charges was not empty and passive but filled with real physical entities, the lines of force, that carried energy and mediated interactions. The scientific community has honored Faraday's memory in numerous ways, perhaps most enduringly through the adoption of the farad as the standard unit of electrical capacitance in the International System of Units. A capacitor with a capacitance of 1 farad will store 1 coulomb of electric charge when a potential difference of 1 volt is applied across its plates. And while this is actually quite a large unit for practical purposes, leading engineers to work more commonly with microfarads and picofarads. The choice of name ensures that Faraday's contributions are invoked every time electrical engineers and physicists discuss the storage and release of electrical energy in circuits and systems around the world. The Royal Institution, where Faraday spent the greater part of his working life and conducted the experiments that changed our understanding of nature, has preserved his basement laboratory as a museum, maintaining it much as it appeared during his years of active research. Visitors to this space can see the original apparatus with which he conducted his investigations, including the iron ring wrapped with copper wire that he used to demonstrate electromagnetic induction on that historic day in August of 1831. There is something deeply moving about standing in the presence of these objects, these modest assemblages of metal and wire and glass that served as instruments of discovery, tools through which one man's curiosity and persistence revealed truths about the fundamental structure of reality. Public commemorations of Faraday have taken various forms over the years since his death. In 1886, a bronze statue was erected at Savoy Place in London, near the headquarters of the Institution of Electrical Engineers, depicting Faraday standing with calm dignity, a figure of quiet authority and intellectual grace. From 1991 until 2001, his likeness appeared on the Bank of England £20 note, bringing his face and his association with electromagnetic discovery into the daily transactions of millions of people, a reminder that the conveniences of modern life rest upon the patient investigations of those who came before. The Royal Society, Britain's premier scientific organisation, awards the Faraday Medal to researchers who have made exceptional contributions to the physical sciences, continuing to invoke his name as a standard of excellence and dedication. The influence of Faraday's work extends far beyond the immediate domain of electromagnetism, for the field concept that he introduced has become one of the central organizing principles of modern physics. Quantum field theory, which provides our deepest current understanding of the fundamental forces and particles of nature, describes reality in terms of fields that permeate all of space and whose excitations manifest as the particles we observe, the photons and electrons and quarks and gluons from which the material world is constructed. The electromagnetic field that Faraday first conceived, with its lines of force spreading through space and carrying energy from point to point, has evolved through a century and a half of theoretical development into the quantum electrodynamic field, the most precisely tested theory in all of physics. Yet the conceptual continuity from Faraday's intuitions to our present understanding remains clear and traceable. Throughout his life, Faraday maintained that his scientific investigations and his religious faith were not in conflict but existed in peaceful coexistence, two complementary ways of approaching the great mysteries of existence. He saw no contradiction in believing that the natural world was governed by regular laws accessible to human reason, while also holding that this order reflected the wisdom and benevolence of a divine creator. The book of nature and the book of scripture spoke to different aspects of human understanding, and Faraday found nourishment in both, drawing from his science a sense of wonder at the intricacy and beauty of creation, and from his faith a sense of humility before truths that exceeded human comprehension. In his own reflections on the relationship between natural philosophy and religious conviction, Faraday expressed the view that the more one understood of the workings of nature, the more clearly one perceived the evidence of design and purpose underlying the apparent chaos of phenomena. He did not see his discoveries as diminishing the mystery of existence, but rather as deepening his appreciation for the vastness of what remained unknown and perhaps unknowable. The same curiosity that drove him to investigate the forces of electricity and magnetism also led him to contemplate questions of meaning and purpose that lay beyond the reach of experimental method, and he pursued both lines of inquiry with the same quiet dedication and the same humble acknowledgement of his own limitations. And so we leave Michael Faraday resting beneath his simple stone at Highgate, beside the wife who shared his journey and supported his work through all the years of discovery and recognition. His legacy lives on in the equations that govern our understanding of light and electromagnetic radiation, in the technologies that carry our voices and images across continents and oceans, in the fundamental concepts that underpin our most advanced theories of matter and energy. He came from humble beginnings, educated himself through patient effort, and through the sheer force of his curiosity and persistence transformed our understanding of the forces that shape the physical world. His life stands as a gentle reminder that knowledge advances not through dramatic leaps alone, but through the steady accumulation of careful observations, thoughtful experiments, and the courage to imagine that the world might work in ways quite different from what previous generations had supposed.